You're live.
Okay, Leanne, we can go ahead and get started.
All right. Thank you, Aaron, and welcome everyone back to this meeting of the CASAC NOx SOx PM secondary panel for the purpose of deliberating on our consensus comments and letter to the administrator. As I said yesterday, our goal is to reach consensus on our draft report. And to meet this goal, we will continue to deliberate on our draft consensus comments before turning to the letter to the administrator. I wish to note that once we conclude our discussion of the consensus comments, further deliberation on our advice should not be needed when we discuss the letter to the administrator, as that is only a distillation of our consensus comments. So I ask that all panelists make sure that we have addressed all of your concerns and considerations, additions, so on in our draft consensus comments before we turn to the letter to the administrator. So here are the tasks for today as I see them. Many of them are summarized in the document that Aaron made public this morning. So we need to make a few edits to chapter 1 that are in that document. We need to make a few edits to chapter 6, consensus comments. And those are also outlined in the document. And in particular, we need to decide if we need to see a revised policy assessment, because that's where we state that in our draft comments. And so we need to make sure we have that discussion. We need to revisit and finish our standard recommendations in chapter 7. So Jim Boylan asked that we ask EPA about why there was no visibility review in this document. So we'll turn to that when we get to that place. We need to decide if we are going to make a recommendation for future reviews that all of the PM secondary evaluation be done together in one place, as opposed to separated the way it is now. We need to finish the 24-hour PM 2.5 standard and consider total reactive nitrogen indicators. And also go back over whatever we discussed yesterday and make sure that we've got all the additions right. We need to make sure we review the minority opinion. Maybe we can figure out how to fold that into the majority. We'll see. There's the last text on network funding before we get to the letter. So that's a rough outline of what I see we need to accomplish with respect to our consensus comments. Is there anyone that has anything else that you wish to bring up before we get to these things? All right, well, given that Mark is here and we deferred some of our chapter 1 decisions to because he wasn't here when we started that yesterday, I suggest we go back to the document on page 7. And if you look at the document that, and maybe Aaron, you could share your screen really quickly. If you look at the document I sent this morning, it summarizes the 2 places that I think we need to have a discussion. So one was on page 7. There's a lot of things to look at. Page 7, lines 6 to 7, and then page 7, lines 7 to 8. So let's see. It takes me even a minute to get to the right place here. So I'm going back to my notes too to make sure that I address. I think it was comments that Mark had made that we were needing to edit. So hold on a second. Yeah, it was the paragraph that starts on line 5. And Mark had commented that we needed to make clear what our recommendation is, that we don't actually want EPA to make their position clear. We want them to reconsider their position. And so the proposed edits are on the screen in front of you, lines 6 and 7, that the KSAC recommends that EPA revisit their interpretation that the Clean Air Act allows only for a standard based on ambient air concentration measurements. So that would replace the sentence that currently starts with "it should be made clear." And then the second edit would be the sentence that starts on line 7, that starts with "as indicated above" would be replaced with "the KSAC finds that a direct atmospheric deposition standard is the most scientifically defensible approach." So I think those address Mark's comments. Does anybody have any? Yes, Rich.
So, yeah, sorry for the last minute note, but I think Jim raised the issue yesterday about EPA's current working definition of ambient air. And I ended up looking that up, and it turns out to me to be completely inappropriate for the evaluation of any welfare effects, because it refers to air outside of buildings to which the public has access. And I really don't think there are very few, if any, welfare effects that depend at all on whether the public has access to the air. So to me, that might be a definition that we could challenge as a part of our recommendation that they should consider a deposition-based approach. To me, it's also something that would be quite feasible, and EPA will push back on this if I'm wrong, but it seems like it would be quite feasible for them to alter something like that, because I just don't think it's justifiable. So I don't know what others think about that.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. Jim.
So I don't know if I raised it or not, but I think when it says that the public has access to, I think what it is doing is basically eliminating the areas that are inside the fence line of industrial facilities is really what it's looking at, eliminating. And I think that's the meaning of that the public has, and it basically means everywhere else outside of industrial facility fence lines and outside people's houses. I think that's what it means.
But it seems to keep working back around to you need to measure the thing in the breathing zone or near the surface and the area to which the public has access. The public doesn't have access to the total column of the atmosphere. So I think that's something that really could and should be revised to better reflect the nature of welfare effects.
Okay, Charlie?
Yeah, so I think Rich brings up a good point, and I think, from my listening in on this, it just seems like it's and then Jim's interpretation, it seems to me that this is poorly defined and really needs a redo on in terms of the definition that we're addressing. So I would support Rich's proposal.
I'm just curious, where is this definition?
Rich, do you want to help people find it?
I mean, what doc is it in the ISA or the PA?
I don't believe so. In the note that I sent out this morning, there's a reference to a recent 2019 memo from Administrator Wheeler to the regional administrators that I think represents the most recent revision to that working definition. So that link is there. And I agree with Jim, almost all of the discussion and revisions to it over the past have all been about sort of emissions source property centric restrictions that, well, it's okay if you don't allow the public on your land, then you can, that's not the ambient air, but it still doesn't make for a definition that's in any way conducive to evaluating effects on welfare.
Just to jump in, yeah, I don't think that definition is in the document, and I think it's in EPA guidance memos, and it's specifically having to do with permit application guidance. And when you're permitting a facility, I know it was defined in some permitting guidance documents from EPA. There might be others, but I think it's done in guidance documents.
So I think our role is to comment scientifically on what we think is relevant, and it sounds to me like what Rich is proposing is based on the scientific perspective that if we're going to address welfare, that there should not be such a restrictive definition that in some sense excludes aspects of the environment that would be affected by plants and other things that are affected by welfare. So Praveen.
Thank you. I thought practical differentiation between outdoor and indoor air, the way I remembered it, was inside the buildings, what we used to call indoor air pollution. And anything which was not inside buildings was outside buildings, including within the fence line. That was outdoor ambient air. And so the welfare effects would apply then to what was in that ambient air. That's my understanding as a policy person over the years. I may be wrong. Maybe Rich, you have a comment. I don't know, or Jim, or both.
So I think the EPA guidance that I've seen clearly says the air inside a fence line of an industrial facility is not ambient air. I think there's clear EPA guidance on that. So are we recommending that EPA change the definition of ambient air? Is that what Rich proposed? Because I was confused.
Rich, do you want to comment on specifically what you're asking for?
Yeah, so I, in that thing I just dashed off this morning, included a proposed revision to the definition with respect to considering welfare effects.
Yeah, and nobody else has seen it, I think, but Aaron and I.
I'm sorry. I thought
No,
sending it. I'm sorry.
No, I think given the timing.
Yeah, we haven't had time to do it yet. I'll work on it right now. I'm not sharing my screen.
Thanks, sir.
So maybe Rich, you could just read it so everybody can hear it, because that works too, to make it public.
Okay, let me find it. So what I said was, and I wanted to toss out one last minute idea regarding EPA's current working definition of ambient air, which is entirely health centric and not conducive to evaluating any welfare effects. I think this definition comes from EPA guidance documents, not directly from the Clean Air Act, and is something we should encourage them to revise. So here's the paragraph. Fundamental problem with the ability to develop effective secondary standards to protect against adverse effects on public welfare is EPA's overly restrictive health-centric definition of ambient air. EPA's formalized and slightly revised this working definition in a series of guidance documents starting in 1980 and most recently in a revised 2019 Wheeler memo with the citation. The initial 1980 definition was, quote, that portion of the atmosphere external to buildings to which the public has access. Various subsequent revisions have added additional restrictions excluding air over properties to which public access is prevented. The, quote, air to which the public has access, unquote, while appropriate for consideration of health effects, is not appropriate for considering welfare effects few of which are dependent on whether the public has access to the air. For example, PM effects on climate, visibility, ozone effects on UV radiation, or trees, effects of S&N deposition. The cast net filter packs, which are the basis of our dry deposition estimates, measure S&N species on top of 10-meter towers, to which the public does not have access. Wet deposition of S&N aggregates pollution present in clouds and the column ambient air beneath them. So I suggested then this revised definition for the purposes of evaluating pollutant effects on public welfare. Ambient air also includes any portion of the atmosphere in which pollutants are present that may reasonably be anticipated to cause or contribute to effects on public welfare.
Okay, and you are proposing that this additional paragraph would be added presumably to the chapter 1 text. Is that what you're thinking?
Something like that. If that's the place where we are suggesting a deposition-based standard would be appropriate to consider, then this might be a component of that.
Yeah, so I think this is the first place that we mention that, if I'm remembering correctly, people can correct me if I'm wrong, is the first place we talk about a deposition, an atmospheric deposition standard. Trying to make sure I remember Praveen's advice. So we can figure out a place to put that, assuming we reach consensus on that. And I'm going to call on Mark.
Yeah, just a question and a comment. So I guess initially I raised my hand because my thought was, gee, if this is not in the Clean Air Act, it's not in the ISA, and it's not in the PA, it doesn't seem like we need to deal with it here. Although, I agree with the point being made. It's quite clear. But if the definition is a separate issue, one option is just not to deal with it here. But on the other hand, if the EPA's view that a deposition standard can't be, is not compatible with the Clean Air Act, or if this definition is shaping EPA's approach to the standard setting, then yeah, it's very relevant to this document and should be addressed. But I haven't heard any mention that in the discussion that the panel has had, which this letter and report are supposed to summarize. I don't know, I think you guys haven't talked about that before, right? Number one. And I guess, so my question is, do we really need to deal with this at this point in time? Or is it going to be, is it going to take away from our message?
Those are some good comments. This is a new idea for me as well, having introduced it just half an hour or so ago. So I don't know, Rich, can you comment further on Mark's questions?
I see Mark's point of view entirely, and so I think the question is EPA itself really hung up on this kind of a definition of ambient air when they have in the past pushed back on the concept of a deposition related standard, for example, in the previous secondary SOx NOx review, saying, no, we can't have a deposition standard. It has to be based on something measured in the ambient air, or pollutants present in the ambient air. And there's that kind of language in the Clean Air Act itself, but there's not really any definition of ambient air in the Clean Air Act. And the only definition that I've been able to find from EPA is the one that I just read, where it's air to which the public has access. So I could go either way. It just occurred to me that it might be a component of how we get to deposition is to first say, you know, this definition really needs to be revised to reflect the fundamental difference of welfare and health effects.
Okay, Christina. You're muted, Christina.
Sorry. So my first question is, it sounds like this definition is an expansion of what's currently considered, and I wanted to know if that was right, Richard.
Well, my understanding is that there have been a number of EPA guidance documents or memos over the years in this particular one that I referenced, and I'm sorry it didn't go out to everybody. I thought it did. There's a reference to it was first specified in 1980 in an EPA memo, and then I think there have been maybe a total of three or four revisions since then, but all of which, as Jim mentioned, are really much more focused on making sure that a polluting source can put up a fence and not have that air on their property to which the public doesn't have access considered part of the ambient air. But still, it's out there and it's their definition of ambient air. And it's a little short when it comes to evaluating welfare effects.
Okay, yeah, I mean, what you've said thus far definitely makes sense in light of what we've been discussing. And I'm wondering, as a general question, well, I guess it's a question for you. Is this a suggestion or a recommendation? Wondering if it's a suggestion, can that be considered and perhaps adopted outside of this process? Or will it change the process that we're in terms of reviewing what we have to review now? And that's kind of it.
I intended it more of as a suggestion. It occurred to me might be a component of a larger argument to try to justify deposition-based standards.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Praveen, did you have a comment on this topic?
Yes, what I was going to say, I keep on saying why EPA is where it has been and what we are trying to do, and they're not there. But the key thing here still is, remember the words themselves, NAAQS. The three in the middle is ambient air quality. I mean, it's not very vague. It's the quality of the air. And it's the ambient air. And we can, disagree what's ambient within the fence, outside the fence, but still air. And air quality is measured in concentrations, ppm, ppb, all that stuff, the whole health standards based on the concentrations. And then when we come to deposition, atmospheric deposition, it's a very different chemical and physical process. It's what deposits on the earth, on trees, on lakes, on the lake watershed, so on, but still depositing. It's a mass units, it's kilograms per hectare per year. So I think and that's one level above than what I think Rich and Jim are discussing. That is, deposition is not air quality. And I think that's where we are all hung up, where EPA is hung up, we are hung up. And we're saying, yeah, we think definition is vague enough. We had that discussion yesterday, and I made the point it's not vague. That's why the difficulty comes. I guess somebody mentioned it's broad. But the point is, we are kind of stuck in that situation, regardless of defined definition, what Rich had earlier, or Jim had different points of view, but still deposition is a different physical chemical process than what's in the air. That's all I said yesterday, and I hope I said it more clearly today.
Well,
Go ahead, Rich.
well, so I guess later on, when somewhere, wherever it is, we're suggesting and advocating a deposition-based standard, I think we made an argument, or I tried to make an argument that deposition is actually a superior indicator to the pollutants that are present in the ambient air compared to what any surface-based measurement of some air concentration would be. And
Of
that's
course.
part of our justification for why we want to go there. So if the ambient air is only the air to which the public has access and doesn't represent that column through which the precipitation removes the pollutants and indicates what they are, it's an indicator of what the pollution was in the ambient air, if the ambient air can extend above breathing zone.
What's in the air? That's the quality. And it's
I'm
not
sorry.
deposition.
Praveen, it's hard to understand you at the moment. I'm not sure why.
Maybe I was talking over Rich. That's why.
Go
Can you
ahead.
hear me now?
Yeah.
No, what I was saying was, the word is not just ambient air, but also the word quality. The quality of air is measured in concentrations, not in deposition. And deposition, as I said, I mean, that's where we hung up. Yeah, hung up. That is, deposition is a very different thing. What falls on the ground, the soil, the trees, the lakes, the forest, the watershed. And that's where we agree, that's where the effects are. Effects are caused by deposition, not what's in the air. And EPA is saying all along, that NOx was just NOx. And whether it's outside the fence, inside the fence, but still air quality.
Okay, so Praveen, you've made that point, and if you want to suggest specific changes to the document, we would be happy to talk about those. So thank you for that. Mark.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, we're talking really now about two different things, and maybe it would help to move things along if we start with one thing. What I'm hearing is the one issue that Richard brought up is this issue of the assumed EPA's definition of ambient air. And the other thing is how appropriate is a deposition standard, and can that be done? I would suggest first we resolve the first question, and I'm still of the opinion that we shouldn't go there. I mean, I agree with it. If the EPA is in fact using that deposition, and I'm not convinced of that, then it's not appropriate for welfare effects. I think that seems clear from the wording that I've heard. But as Jim's saying, if this is not in a major document, and we don't know, we can ask EPA, but I would say we should just put this issue aside, because it's not crucial to the message that we're sending in this letter, that we think a deposition standard needs to be considered here. If EPA needs to redefine ambient air in order to do that, then they can do that. We don't have to do that for them. We don't even know if they're really using that definition when it comes to the secondary standard. So my suggestion, just to move things along, is to do away with that. In terms of Praveen's comments about, I thought that there was pretty much consensus that that we were recommending that they consider a deposition-based standard. I think it's up to EPA to figure out whether the Clean Air Act allows them to do that or not, and that's more of a lawyer thing or whatever. I think we're making recommendations based on the science, and I think the language, as the changes we've talked about so far, certainly addresses my concerns in the way we've expressed that.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And I would agree with your comments that I thought we also had reached consensus about recommending that EPA suggest a deposition-based standard, and we will come back to that in the Chapter 7 text as well. And so you're making, getting back to the first point, you're making the point that we really don't need to address this in the document. I don't know if there's anyone at EPA that would care to comment, I will invite them to do so if they wish to help us navigate this. Yeah, I hear your point that we may not need to go there because it hasn't been addressed in the documents. However, I think what I heard Rich say was that it's relevant to how things would move forward. And scientifically, I think we can make a statement that that for welfare effects, the ambient air definition should not be as restrictive as it might be appropriately for health effects. So, Christina. You're muted.
Okay, so I just wanted to, just to remind everyone that when we're discussing, things like this is kind of consensus comments and things like that, or what's going in the letter. But there may be issues that are very important, like this one, that can also be put in the individual comments as well, so that they are maybe not lost just because it's not, kind of the majority opinion or something. There may be others who haven't spoken up about this topic that may want to put something like this, in their individual comments. So just that kind of reminder that that's a very important thing that will also be reviewed.
Thank you.
I'm happy to do that.
All right, so it sounds like moving forward, maybe unless Ivan has something he wants to share that helps us change course. Maybe that.
Nothing profound, and I don't have the expertise to judge. I feel like a lot of this discussion is around the legal aspects rather than the scientific aspects. But before we moved on, I just wanted to a voice of support, particularly for the last couple of sentences in Rich's passage. And with a friendly amendment for purposes of scientifically evaluating pollutant effects on public welfare, ambient air quality, and insert the word quality. It's not concentration, it's quality. And so the suggestion that scientific evaluation of quality would also include et cetera, in the rest of that sentence. But I think that's a great sentence. Thanks.
Okay, so would it make sense based on this and to recommend that the bulk of this go into Rich's individual comments, and that last sentence edited as Ivan suggested, maybe get inserted into the chapter 1 text somewhere? And we'll find an appropriate place for that. Maybe that's a middle ground that will hopefully satisfy everyone. Bob?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Rich for bringing this up, and I agree that it's a important point. And the question before us is whether including it as a major part of our report early on adds to or distracts from our central message that we want to have a deposition-based standard based on the science. My personal thought is it actually does strengthen it, as Rich argued. I don't think it's just a legal discussion. It really is a science issue. If you go back to the history of the Clean Air Act and Clean Air Act as amended, a huge amount of the discussion in Congress and the political will for that came out of the interest in acid rain, which is a deposition issue. It's not a concentration in the atmosphere issue. So I think reminding EPA that as scientists, we think air quality includes deposition, and the science tells us that deposition is the perhaps cleanest way to regulate these welfare effects. I think that's really important. So thank you for bringing up Rich.
All right, so we were discussing the paragraph on page 7 that started on line 5. It had a couple of specific suggestions. I've had multiple points of view on whether to add this text or not, and how much of it. Stephen, are you going to help us navigate this? You're muted.
Yeah, thank you. I apologize for joining in late. I was teaching about atmospheric aerosols. I don't know exactly. I don't think I'm going to help you navigate it, but I'm increasingly persuaded that well, the first question is from a legal perspective, can EPA set a standard for deposition? And I don't know the answer to that. And I think it's very important. I think each EPA needs to respond to that question if they can or if they can't. If they can't, then there's no sense talking about a deposition standard. We have to stay with a concentration standard.
Can I stop you right there? First of all, I think we have settled that point, that we are making the scientific argument that we think the deposition is the important way to look at this. And we are also providing advice in Chapter 7 about the concentration-based standards. So it's up to EPA to address the legality. We are a scientific panel, so we are not going to address that, but we are going to address the scientific perspective. And so I think we've settled that point already in our draft. Sorry to interrupt you, but I want to
No,
make sure.
I'm good. I don't want to beat the horse if it's already dead. And I'm pleased with that recommendation, and I certainly support it. I still think that there's a role for us saying, if they can't, and that's an open question, if they can't set a deposition standard, we're stuck with a concentration standard, then in order to protect these ecosystems that are sensitive to deposition, I think we have to suggest a way that EPA can set a concentration standard that will be protective in terms of deposition. And I had some offline email exchange with Rich last night to that effect. If I can just briefly summarize, and I think we have to assume that it's an if and give EPA some advice. If they cannot set a deposition standard, then to my thinking, set a concentration standard that is in some sense the alternative to the deposition standard. And the concentration standard would be the maximum tolerable deposition flux, the maximum concentration, the standard would be that maximum deposition, the minimum deposition flux divided by deposition velocity. That's for dry depth. And that gets you out of it. And it also says, EPA, you don't have to model concentrations by CMAQ or by this new scheme that you've come up with. All you have to do is set a standard. And to set the standard, here's how you go about it, period, full stop. And thinking about the wet depth, the mean residence time of sulfate nitrate aerosols in the atmosphere is about a week. So if you set a concentration standard at the surface, you multiply by the height of a boundary layer, and that's the amount of material in the atmosphere. You divide by a week, and you've got a concentration standard for wet depth, full stop. So I think it's been very enlightening for me to kind of do this algebra in my head. And I think it could shorten the report by 300 pages. You just have to set a concentration standard. You don't have to do any modeling. Okay, I'll quit there.
Stephen, it sounds like some valuable suggestions. You may or may not have seen it. There was a document that Aaron sent this morning that I authored with input from others. that has some suggested additional text about specifically, Rich wrote this about deposition that's been added to it. It's on that document, page 2, starting on line 30. So I suggest that while we're trying to wrap up our discussion of chapter 1, that maybe you look at that and see whether you want to propose any specific changes to the text, because we need to reach consensus on our document. That's our goal, and we can't be we need to like be concrete. we can't be suggesting things orally and just expecting that they'll get integrated. We need to be concrete today.
Okay, let me have a look at that as I get a chance. No, I haven't been able to check my email yet this morning. I'll try to come up with something, maybe a paragraph or something that speaks to what I just said.
Okay, that would be very helpful, and we appreciate that. And or edits to what's already proposed in writing.
Excellent, thank you.
Praveen, do you have any, we don't want to revisit this.
Yeah, sure.
old
But
point. I'm
sorry.
sorry, we're having a hard time hearing you.
Okay, can you hear me this time? Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. Just historical perspective again, I agree with what Rich is saying, and deposition is where we need to go. But to be aware, when we went through this thing, deposition-based standards, what, 8-10 years ago, the key argument EPA made in their Federal Register when Lisa Jackson was the administrator said, yeah, it's wonderful, you know, there are great points here, deposition-based standards, but too much uncertainty in the language when it comes to requisite standards. So there was too much uncertainty, therefore they did not agree. And then EPA made the point they were the keeper of uncertainty, not us. And so I think what I'm saying is deposition, yes, but we got to be cognizant of the fact that we need to pay maybe special attention to why we think uncertainty is not so bad based on deposition standards. That's all I was going to say, based on what occurred.
Okay, well, thank you for that point. If you have some suggested edits to the document, we will.
Yes.
Them. So thank you for that. And well, I'll make sure before we move to the letter that we circle back, and anything that people might have said that they want to propose edits to the document, we have an opportunity to entertain that. All right, so what I'm hearing, at least what I thought we might be able to reach consensus, was taking the point made of picking up the last sentence of Rich's document, which is on line 28 in quotes, for the purposes of evaluating pollutant effects on public welfare. Ambient air also includes any portion of the atmosphere in which pollutants are present that may reasonably be anticipated to cause or contribute to effects on public welfare. There was a minor edit to that, hopefully somebody caught. And I'm suggesting that we add that to the chapter 1 text in an appropriate place, and that Rich put the rest of this text in his individual comments. Is that something we can reach consensus on? Mark, you were one of the people that had a problem with this. Is that okay with you?
It is okay with me.
Okay, and Rich, is that okay with you? Okay. All right, so I believe we have finished addressing changes as currently proposed to chapter 1. Does anybody else have anything they wish to bring up with respect to changes to chapter 1? Jim Boylan.
We talked about page 5. Mark Franton had a comment that he wasn't here yesterday to discuss about the precautionary principle and how it applies to the secondary standards. I thought we were going to go back to that sentence.
I thought we.
Page 5, lines 24 to 26. Had we?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yes, I did not. So Lorraine Chestnut made some proposed edits to this, which I don't think have been made public, that I thought addressed all these comments. Lori, are you in a position where you can help us navigate this?
Yeah, I sent some revised language, late yesterday that takes out the reference to precautionary principle and just makes the point that that there's been a trend over time of increasing, finding more and more effects, more and more causal effects, and that suggests that you might want to choose a standard on the lower end of the range in terms of being protective, but taking out any language that suggests a margin of safety, that's only in the health language, in the health standard language. So I think the main point here is that uncertainty means there's risks in both directions of over controlling or under controlling, and the way the document presents uncertainty, it's kind of undercuts the confidence that we know there's these effects. I mean, it's well established in the science. So I think that's the main point of that section. And I don't know do you want me to try to put those changed wording up for people to look at, or see if that's.
Yeah, let's see. Mark has his hand up. See if people need to see it. I reviewed it and I thought it didn't. I didn't incorporate. I should have incorporated in the document that went out this morning. I apologize that I didn't get there. But I reviewed it and I thought it met the spirit of the concern and it was well worded. And so it struck me as more wordsmithing as opposed to needing to redeliberate the point. So I'm okay if people are willing to go with this. I'm okay with not sharing that specific text, but let's hear what Mark has to say.
Yeah, so I still would be concerned, having not seen the language, but hearing it described. I mean, I wasn't so much concerned with the wording precautionary principle. It's that using previous trends to help identify an appropriate level for a standard. I don't think that should be the consideration. I think it should be based on the levels where we see effects. And I take the point that the adequate margin of safety, that wording is intended for health effects and not for the welfare effects. But I think your point is a good one, that, there's uncertainty here, and, there certainly may be in yet to be done studies, effects identified at ever lower concentrations. But I don't think we can set a standard based on what we think might happen in the future. I think we have to use the evidence at hand to set an appropriate standard that would prevent those effects that we know about. So my proposal is to take out that wording entirely and not use that as a basis for setting the standard.
Yeah, I'm not sure that was the specific, because this is a section, overarching comments on uncertainty. So I think we should go, Lorraine, I'll let you speak in just a second. I think we may need to make your comments public so people can deliberate on it, and we can ask Aaron to do that and circle back to this before we get to the letter, but go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to clarify that I think the wording, the intended wording is that the fact that we continue to find more and more effects can help us in selecting within the range that the evidence shows. So not like picking a standard that's outside the range of the evidence, but we typically have a range. And so how do we decide? Do we always go at the upper end because we don't want to over control? Do we go to the lower end? So within the evidence, I think, is how it's intended to be worded.
Okay, so let's revisit this. I want to make sure everybody's happy. Aaron, are you able to, while we're discussing, make those proposed edits in a public document that we can look at all together?
This will be challenging because she made red line strikeouts to the entire report, so I can't do that very easily on the fly right now.
Okay. All right. I was thinking it was just like 2 paragraphs, I think, that needed to be looked at. So I think that's all we're really talking about, not the entire report. Let's come back and revisit this perhaps after the break. And let's move on right now to edits to chapter 6. So in the document that I shared on the first page, there is lines 18 through 31 talk about the proposed edits to chapter 6. So that would be, we're now moving to our consensus comments, page 24. And so, there's a minor change to proposed on page 24, line 23. Just adding qualification, assuming the EPA continues to use the EAQM approach. And then the rest of the sentence, the CASAC offers the following detailed comments on the EAQM method for EPA's consideration. And that's just to acknowledge that, that we have multiple points of view about the validity of that. The next proposed edit on page 24, this we talked about, lines 43 to 45. Rich asked that bullet be dropped. So I'm just confirming, and just speak up if you have any objections to these edits. And then on page 25, line 12, the bullet before line 12, Jim Boylan had asked that a bullet be added, and with some offline iteration, this got edited a little bit as appears in the document. Aaron, would you mind sharing my document that got circulated this morning?
Sorry, I'm working on Lorraine's thing. Did you want? I'm sorry, I'm trying to, and someone else just emailed me asking me. I'm trying to balance here, okay?
Okay, yes, fair enough. I'll read it. People have it in front of them. Yes, there's a lot of things to keep on top of. I appreciate what everybody is able to do. All right, so he's got that right in front of us, line 22. So the text that Jim is asking us to insert is the use of nearby SO2 and NO2 monitors to evaluate S and N deposition inside the ecoregion may not be appropriate, since the majority of the sulfate and nitrate being deposited is regional in nature and transported from far outside the ecoregion. There was some additional text that got dropped. So wanted to make sure people are okay with that. And then the final edit, and this will probably take the most discussion, but before we move there, I see Stephen has his hand up.
Yes, thank you. I take exception to the sentence beginning at line 24. Maybe the intent of that sentence is to distinguish between sulfate and nitrate versus SO2 and NO2. But I would certainly say that the use of nearby monitors for SO2, NO2, sulfate, and nitrate may be the most appropriate means of calculating the deposition of these quantities full stop, and get away from the issue of regional nature and transported from far outside the ecoregion. Local measurements, to my thinking, are the best way to calculate local deposition. We may not have enough of those measurements. We use the most proximate ones. SO2 and NO2 deposition is mainly through dry deposition. We use locally evaluated deposition velocities. Sulfate and nitrate is mostly through wet deposition. And I think means of estimating that wet deposition from local measurements is the best way to do that, and just get rid of the issues of the where it comes from and the regional in nature. Thank you.
Hey, Stephen, so just to follow up, so I would agree for dry deposition, but I think the majority of the sulfate and nitrate is coming from wet deposition versus dry deposition, and you're talking about dry deposition of SO2 and NO2. You're not talking about dry deposition of nitric acid and things like that. You're talking about dry deposition of SO2 and NO2, and I would agree that local measurements of SO2 and NO2 would accurately characterize that. But correct me if I'm wrong, the majority of the total deposition, majority of it is a wet deposition, and those are coming from sources far away.
Yeah, I would include the nitric acid in the dry dep, but I agree with you that for the gases, the majority of the dep is dry dep. And I agree with you that for the particulate matter, the majority of the dep is wet dep. But I think the origin of the material that gets deposited in the wet dep is the material that's present in the column that's above the locus of interest. So if we can in some way estimate the amount of material that's in that atmospheric column and estimate the rate at which that material is brought to the surface by wet dep, we avoid any kinds of issues of having to model transport to the locus of interest. We just focus upon the amount of material that's present at the locus of interest. And then the question is, how well can we estimate that? Well, we kind of concede, agree that deposition velocity would be a good way to estimate the rate of deposition of the gases. And then the question is, how do we estimate the rate of deposition of the sulfate nitrate aerosol from local measurements? And I think I would have a lot more confidence in that approach of estimating deposition flux than I would in any kind of modeled transport and deposition.
Okay, but that's not what EPA did with their model. The EPA was correlating ambient measurements of SO2 and NO2 at the monitors to total sulfur and nitrate deposition. So what you described is different. I'm commenting specifically on using the NO2 and SO2 monitors that are nearby to quantify the total deposition. I think I've heard other people agree that, the majority of this is being transported in from long distances.
Yeah, I think we'll agree that the sulfate nitrate, and for that matter, the NO2 and SO2 may be transported from long distances. But I think that's where it gets transported from is irrelevant. What's relevant to the particular ecosystem is how much it gets, not where it came from.
Yeah, but the EPA model is assuming that it's all local, and that's a comment on the model, something that needs to be addressed in the model, that this is an important thing it doesn't account for, and that's what's being pointed out with this.
Yes.
I would certainly concur in the statement that you made that I mean, the model has many deficiencies, of which that's one. I'm trying to make the argument, get rid of the model, throw it away, and just focus on the amount of material that's present at the locus of deposition and the rate at which that material that's present there gets deposited, full stop.
Okay, Stephen, thank you for that. That's a very important point. I think it's already reflected in the Chapter 6 text. What we are discussing now is the specific bullets that go with the statement that we just edited that says, if EPA continues to use this model, these things need to be addressed. And so Jim has proposed adding this bullet, which it sounds like you, given the model, you agree with. And so I think it's okay to add that bullet. That's my understanding from your conversation. The point you're making, please look at, and I think you were part of the Chapter 6 subgroup, please look at the entire Chapter 6 consensus comments and make sure your point of view that they shouldn't be using this at all is appropriately reflected, because that is an important point of view that we want to make sure is addressed in our consensus comments. But this part of the report is, given the model, these are things that need to be addressed. So that's what we're deliberating right now. And Praveen, if you have comments on that particular deliberation, I'd be happy to entertain them now.
Okay, I have this page 24, line 23, what we say add to the beginning, assuming EPA continues to use the EAQM approach. I thought our discussion yesterday, maybe I didn't get it right, that maybe the EAQM was kind of beyond repair, and maybe we should just drop this discussion and change the letter to administrator to reflect that. But maybe not. I just.
Well, if you go back and look at our draft consensus comments, we very clearly, for instance, on page 24, line 1, the Case Act does not have consensus on its response to the technical approach taken, and goes on to say something, we shouldn't use it, basically. Others find that it has some value. And then we go on to say, well, everyone agrees that as the way it was written up was not adequate. And then what we're deliberating on now is, if they continue to use this model, which I agree, not everybody thinks we should, and I didn't hear we have complete consensus on that, that we should throw it out. So our report right now does not say they should throw it out. It says, some people basically think that, but others don't. And
okay, then, Leanne, I thought after that detailed discussion yesterday, I thought we kind of all agreed that maybe this is not, we should go, or maybe I just got it wrong.
well, that's what we will deliberate next. If you want to look ahead, I want to make sure we reach consensus on Jim's added bullet. And then we will move to page 25, the paragraph that starts on line 37. And that would be an important place for you to weigh in about this aspect. And maybe we want to change that paragraph completely. So do we have consensus that we can add this bullet that Jim has proposed as it appears in the front of us on lines 24 through 26? I'm not seeing any objections, so I can move on. All right, moving on now to that paragraph I just referred to. This is a very important paragraph in our Chapter 6 consensus comments. So the simple change is to change once to if, acknowledging that the EAQM analysis maybe should not be updated. It should be thrown, effectively implying it should be thrown out. That's probably a simple change to make. We also need to address our advice to EPA on this. So, Stephen. You need to unmute. If you're speaking, you need to unmute, Stephen.
Sorry, I'm working on a laptop. Don't have my large screen in front of me. Too many things to juggle. I didn't get my hand up quick enough when you were asking about lines 24 to 26. I'm sorry.
Sure.
The clause, since the majority of sulfate and nitrate being deposited is regional in nature and transported from far outside the ecoregion, I consider totally irrelevant to the objective and to the sentence, to the objective of the whole endeavor of trying to protect sensitive ecosystems. It doesn't, the ecoregion doesn't care where the sulfate and nitrate came from. It cares how much is being deposited. And how much is being deposited depends on how much is there at the time of deposition. It doesn't care where the sulfate and nitrate came from. So I take great exception to the since clause in that sentence. As far as the use of the nearby monitors, I would say use of nearby monitors is, when available, is the best way to estimate the deposition.
All right, so either we edit this as you're proposing, which I hear is to delete the since clause.
And change the first clause.
And then we need to change the first clause, or we put in multiple points of view in addition to this bullet, in which case I need you to propose some very specific text, because our goal here is to deliberate on a written document and not to continue to air our opinions without having anything written down. So you're making a very important point. And we need to either decide how to edit this bullet, or perhaps add an additional bullet that frankly could contradict this bullet, since these are all just points we're making that that we want EPA to consider with respect to this model. So Rich, you're going to help us navigate this?
Probably not. But it just occurs to me, I think EPA in developing this analysis really got overly enamored with the scatter plot concept. We've got all these scatter plots, so many of them, all of which are trying desperately to find some relationship between local ambient air quality and local deposition. But if you consider, let's say there actually is a standard that gets put forward, where's the standard going to be exceeded by the most? Not necessarily in the sensitive Adirondack Peak region, but rather in the areas of the highest emissions density. And, where are the most controls going to be focused if there was a standard? And it's not going to be, you're going to fix the deposition here or there, most likely by controls in the local area. It's going to relate, as it always has in the past, to controlling the emissions, where they're greatest. So I just wanted to kind of throw out, I think we can get overly dependent on this idea of trying to relate the local air quality to the local deposition, which isn't necessarily of that critical importance.
Okay, and if you have specific proposed edits to help us reach consensus about these points, I'd love to hear them as we move forward. I see Bill McDowell has his hand up, and then Davin, I'll call on you. I see your and not on Zoom, but on the video. So go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it's important that the text under consideration about the local monitors, I just don't think it's fair or accurate to say that local monitors will always give us the best measure of S and N deposition, which is what I hear Stephen saying, but I'm not sure, maybe I'm misinterpreting, because the monitor is at a fixed height and the deposition, the cloud tops are way up there. How can, and the rain contains the sulfate and the nitrate, sulfuric and nitric acids, you know, well above any point that it's being monitored. And so I think it's unquestionable, it's certainly clear that regional patterns of emission of SO2 and to a certain extent NOx contribute to regional patterns in effects that are expressed via deposition. And we don't want to be saying that one is always better and one is always worse. I think it's just, we're just going to keep going around in circles. And I think there's simply a fundamental disagreement about what is meant here, that the monitors, if they were perfect at the local scale, well, maybe they would be perfectly suited to measure deposition, but they don't. They're not perfectly suited. So they don't measure it very well, very often, in my experience. So anyway, I just think we'll just keep going around in circles, and we need to just change the sentence around to be much less specifically saying this is how it works, but it could work this way, it could work that way. You need to have a broader approach.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like an edit to the sentence that says something like the use of nearby SO2 and NO2 monitors to evaluate S and N deposition inside the regional ecoregion won't always give the best reflection of deposition, period.
It may not always give the best.
May not. Thank you.
And it just it may not. That's been demonstrated. And the report, the PA shows that it's not always very good.
All right. So is
I would be good with that. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, thank you. And Jim, if you wouldn't mind making sure that gets emailed so we don't lose it or have to go back to the transcript. If that gets emailed to Aaron and me, that would be great.
Okay.
So I think we've got that resolved, unless one of the other commenters with their hands up has something to say about this point. Tavin?
Thanks. I managed to get my hand up. Thank you, Aaron, for helping with that. I was literally going to make the same suggestion as Bill. So thank you for saying that. Just I'd be much more comfortable if it said, you know, may, put the word may or may not in here, in recognition of the cases where long-range transport is a governing process, but also in recognition of the situations like Rich is pointing out that you're right next to a source and it really is a local issue. So I think that's a great suggestion, and I'd be happy with that edit.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
The word may is already in there. So just to note, the word may is in there.
Okay. Davin, did you want to continue to say something? Or you're okay, there you go. And Stephen, do you have specific edits to the points in this section of the document?
Yeah, I'm trying to work on them.
Okay.
And my screen keeps jumping around when you go to putting up text, so then it's a struggle. In any event, I'm listening to the comments, and I think what Bill said, that the concentration of sulfate and nitrate aerosol at the surface may not be representative of
No. So he's saying that not the concentration of sulfate and nitrate aerosol, the concentration of SO2 and NO2 gas phase. That's what we're talking about. The concentration of SO2 and NO2 gas phase, I think. Is that right?
Let me say what I thought him to have said. That as far as the sulfate and nitrate aerosol is concerned, the concentration at the surface may not be representative of the concentration that's at cloud level. And I think that's an accurate statement. But I think that's, given vertical mixing through the boundary layer, I think the concentrations of sulfate and nitrate aerosol at the surface are probably a better estimate of the concentrations at cloud level than what certainly this EAQM model is going to give, and possibly even CMAQ is going to give. So what we may end up recommending is perhaps a variety of approaches to try to relate local concentrations, which is the standard that is available, to the deposition, and not necessarily advocate the best approach.
Yeah, so if you want to suggest any further additions to the bullets that are in the document for this EAQM approach, we'd be more than happy to entertain them. We have made, I think, edits to the proposed bullet that Jim Boylan suggested that everybody's happy with. So we're going to consider that case closed, and feel free to propose specific text if you want to add anything about these points, because we are beyond oral deliberations that somehow make their way into the text. We need to deal with the very specific edits at this point, or we're never going to finish this meeting today, and we don't have another one scheduled.
Okay,
So,
thank you for that. I'll try to work on it and do the best I can.
yes, thank you. Appreciate that. All right, so now I think we're on to the paragraph in chapter 6 that's on page 25, line 37. I don't think I heard any objection to the changing once to if, acknowledging that we don't all have the same point of view about this EAQM approach. I think we need to deliberate on whether we are going to ask for a second draft of the policy assessment if new EAQM results are meaningfully different, if we want to see a second draft no matter what, or what we want to do. I think this is a very important decision that we need to make today, is what advice we're going to give to EPA about a revised document. And as I mentioned yesterday, whatever advice we give, given the court order deadline, may not be followed. But that's not for us to decide. Our role is to decide what we think is the best advice scientifically. Jim.
Well, I think if EPA listens to the advice and actually does come up with deposition-based standards in the next version of the policy assessment, I think we all agree we want to see that. Would we not agree with that? Because I mean, right now, I mean, we don't know what the levels are. We don't know, how any of this is, what the form of the standard is. We don't know any of this stuff. And so, I mean, I think if EPA does come up with deposition-based standards in the next policy assessment, I think we'd all want to see that.
Yeah, and so I think our advice as it appears in chapter 7 is that would be in a future review. I don't think that one thinks it's realistic for it to happen in this review.
I agree. Yeah.
So so I think that this advice, at least as it's currently worded, is about updating the EAQM analysis. And we gave EPA discretion about giving us a second draft of the policy assessment. So I think we probably want to stick with that and not go beyond that to the deposition based standards, since we are not even asking for that in this review.
Yeah, I would agree. And I guess especially if the justification, if EPA uses the EAQM as justification for lowering the standards, and the EAQM significantly changes or meaningful changes, right? I think we would probably want to see that. I would think so. So maybe the wording that's in there is appropriate. Is that what
Well, that's the question. I wanted to make sure that we had affirmation that we agreed with the wording or we wanted to change it. And this is our opportunity to do that. Praveen.
Thank you. I just heard what Jim and you said. The EPA to come back with an approach which is based on deposition standards. That's going to be a major undertaking.
Yes, that will not happen
EPA.
in this, that will not happen in this review. So we are not deliberating on that point at this point.
So we are essentially saying to EPA, Diane, whenever that occurs, deposition-based approach, that will come in future years.
That's what's currently drafted in Chapter 7, correct?
And the other major point is this EQAM, and you replace, I guess, once with if. When we come back to the letter to the administrator, I assume we're going to say, yeah, go ahead, if you're going to do it, just do it in a better way.
The letter is to the administrator is a distillation of this text. So we are reaching consensus about our the comments about Chapter 6 right now. And then the letter, when we review the letter to the administrator, our goal is to make sure that it reflects the advice that we're agreeing upon now. So,
and the way that language is in the letter presently, and what we just discussed here, I think it says, go ahead, update it, and do these changes and come back to us with this new and improved EQAM approach.
We will get to the letter. The text in front of us says, we want to see a second draft of the policy assessment if the EAQM results are meaningfully different from the results.
Okay, got it.
That's what we're deliberating on. I'm not hearing anybody suggesting changing it. So unless I see someone who wants to speak up, I'm going to assume that we are okay with the current wording and we are not definitively asking for a policy revised second draft. We are leaving it up to EPA's judgment, acknowledging that if the results are meaningfully different, we do want to see it. Okay, I think we're on to Chapter 7. So we are, where are we? So this document, page 27, line 13 to 14. This paragraph is a fairly important paragraph in this document, and we've got a number of proposed edits to this section that we'll need to talk about at some length. So the first thing that I wanted to check is the sentence on line 13. Chapter 7 adequately summarized the information on potential welfare effects of NNS in ambient air and in deposition reviewed in the ISA and PA. Given some of the discussion, this was actually my request to just make sure that we agree with that statement. I felt like it might have contradicted some of the points we made in the chapter and 4 and 5 write-up about being faithful to the ISA. So the reason for this discussing this sentence is just to make sure everybody agrees that that is an appropriate sentence. Charlie.
Yeah, I don't think it is consistent with what we said in chapter 4 and 5. And as we indicated in chapter 4 or 5, if you look at in the ISA, the information about causality was clearly not reflected in the PA. There was a disconnect. In fact, I think we may have used wording very similar to that only maybe a subset of the effects that were indicated in the ISA were really brought forward in the PA. So I think that this and my people who worked on that section with me, I think they should weigh in, but I think that was a large point of our rather lengthy discussion about talking all the literature that was ignored in the PA.
All right, thank you. And that's one of the reasons why I brought it up, because that I flagged it, because when I read this, I was like, wait a minute, this seems like we're making we're not making the point we made earlier. Frank, are you going to help us with this?
I worked with that group, Charlie and Ivan and others, and I just wanted to confirm what Charlie just said.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So it sounds like we need to edit this sentence, and I hear the intent is clear, so I think we can do that editing offline. So we need to, and Charlie, I'm going to ask you if you are in a position to take the lead on this.
So how do you want me to do it? Just write in Word or in an email what the alternative wording would be and then send it to Aaron?
Yeah, and you're welcome to run it by anybody as long as it's less than half of us. If that you wish to get input on, but our intent is clear, so we don't need to wordsmith the details since our intent is clear. So we're going to edit that sentence to reflect the fact that the chapter 4 and 5 conclusions said something different. Okay, thank you. I think we're on to this, a couple of things got changed. The next bullet proposes an edit that is no longer valid. Page 27, line 16. The organization of the additional text that Alexandra Panet Gonzalez proposed got swapped, and this got missed. So you can ignore the text on line 37 to 38 as no longer relevant. Let's just deal in order. So page 27, line 18, wanted to make sure that the revisions to the standard put forth for consideration are generally supported by the evidence in the ISA, the draft PA, and in the July 24-27 follow-up memos. I want to make sure that this is clear, that this is CASAC's advice. So the revisions to the alternative standards CASAC puts forth for consideration. So that is the proposed edit, just to make it clear in that sentence that that we're talking about our advice. Mark Frampton.
Yes, I'm actually back on line 14. Yes, so we talked about lines 13 and 14, but then the next sentence on line 14, it says, as noted above, the CASAC urges the EPA to adopt secondary standards based on deposition. I think we should change that to say, urges EPA to consider adopting secondary standards in the next review.
Yeah, and we do say that in a text that we're about to deliberate on in a little bit. We can edit it here too. So that point in the next review does made, and we can do that here as well. I'll consider that a wordsmithing because we are going to address that in a minute.
Good.
And you also softened it. You urges them to consider. I think I'm hearing that the panel is pretty unequivocal. It's more than consider. It's like, we think that's scientifically the way to go. Yeah,
that's fine.
Yeah, okay. All right, so we had already, and I'm just doing this in the order of what's in the memo. We're going to circle back to the text that Mark just talked about in a second with respect to this entire paragraph. So following along on the memo that from me that Aaron released this morning. This is a conversation we had yesterday on line 20 to delete that sentence that starts with moreover. And Davin actually recommended some additional text that we talked about yesterday. And so that is the recommendations below frequently refer to figures in chapter 6 based on the ecoregion analysis conducted by EPA using the EAQM model. Many of the correlations therein between ambient concentration metrics and SRN deposition were notably small statistically. The Case Act notes, however, that in these figures, there are often identifiable thresholds of ambient concentrations below which deposition effects are less concerned, even when the direct correlations between concentrations and deposition at higher concentration values are minimal. Corroboration with additional evidence, such as analysis based on TDEP, is referenced where available. So this addresses the point we talked about yesterday that in our recommended alternative standards, we have that we are using figures in chapter 6 that are based on the EAQM approach, but we are not relying solely on them, and they are informing our overall advice, adding strength, I guess, is one way of looking at it. So Stephen.
Yeah, again, I'm uneasy about the reliance on the model, be it the EAQM, less uneasy about the TDEP. The TDEP is at least for gases relating to local concentrations to local deposition. I would I'm trying to come up with language that speaks to some of the members of the panel were concerned about that approach, which doesn't put words in the mouth of everybody, but at least may strike some resonance with some of the members of the panel. So again,
Yes.
I'm trying to be rather general. It'll be referring to chapters 6 and 7. And again, the lack of correspondence of wet depth of sulfate and nitrate to local measurements of SO2 and NO2 is not at all surprising. They're different substances and there's chemistry and whatnot involved. So that should not be used to undermine the value of local measurements. If we had local sulfate and nitrate measurements, I think that correspondence would be a lot better, but that's in some way a challenge to EPA to come up with that. Okay.
Okay, so I think that's an important point, and I appreciate that you are working on text that would get added. I think that belongs, from what I've heard, in chapter 6. In chapter 7, the point being made here is that in the justifications for the standards, for instance, the annual standard on page 28, we make a recommendation and then we talk about figures in the report that are in chapter 2, which is, I think, where the TDEP results are, some of the chapter 6 that aren't based on the EAQM, and then also some of the figures based on the EAQM. And we had the discussion yesterday that it wasn't that these were, that we were relying on the high correlations or that they were highly predictive, but that they do provide evidence about a threshold. And that's what this text is trying to address, is my understanding. And so I want to make sure that people agree with adding that. And David, I'm looking at you since you proposed this text, if you want to weigh in at all.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think that's a good summary, and I'm glad to modify this text in any way. But I think this was the point that we were trying to get across yesterday, that the noise in these correlations is quite considerable, and the correlations are often quite small. That being said, there are sort of ranges of concentration levels below which the deposition amount is in the range that we're targeting with these standards. And so it's identifying, or it's just sort of like saying how we're using these figures in general in this process. And again, where possible, referencing other figures and other parts of the report to provide additional evidence for the levels being proposed.
All right, thank you. And so hopefully, Stephen, that addresses your concern. We are not exclusively relying on this for our recommended standards.
Actually, I rather like that language.
Thank you. We all appreciate that. Okay, so now we're still on this paragraph, and now that we're on to page 2 of this memo. This is lengthy text, which has the beginning part of it is the text that Alexandra Panet-Gonzalez proposed and was distributed a few days ago, I think before the holiday weekend. And then there's some additional text starting on line 30 of this memo on page 2. If you want to scroll down a little bit more, Aaron. That Rich Poirot proposed, which is about talking about what the indicator should be if we're going to recommend and mark on line 29. That's the sentence that very clearly says direct atmospheric deposition standards be considered in future reviews. And then the rest of the paragraph goes on to say how to measure it. And actually there's 3 paragraphs that address that. And so the proposal is that that in the original document on page 27, it is go after the sentence that starts on line 14 that says, as noted above, the KSAC urges, and we can edit this as Mark talked about, but I'm not going to do that now. EPA to adopt secondary standards based on deposition rather than exposure, given the strong decades-long evidence for deposition related effects on ecosystems. And then instead of the sentence that starts because, we would then move on to the text that starts on this memo on page 9 of page 2, to protect public welfare against the effects of NOx, SOx, and PM, and so on. And so that's the proposal, that text be added here. And Jim.
Yeah, so in general, I'm good with the text. I guess my question is for TDEP, correct me if I'm wrong, but TDEP includes dry deposition of ammonia gas. Is that correct? And if so, I don't think that's allowed to be included in TDEP because it's not a criteria air pollutant. So I don't know if anybody wants to address that. I don't know if Rich wants to address that.
Well, I guess, the only way to get at any of the ammonia components of nitrogen deposition is if we're strictly limited to existing criteria pollutants, then ammonium would be a component of PM, and ammonia would be an important precursor to PM, and in that way gets captured. And especially now, if we're talking about, effects of secondary effects of SOx, NOx, and PM. So that's our only route into into the reduced ammonia.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that the PM portion of the ammonium is captured by the PM criteria pollutants. But, you know, typically precursors, I mean, precursors to ozone are NOx and VOCs. We don't have VOC ambient air quality standards. I mean, so precursors are, you know, you can't really do, it has to be a criteria air pollutant to be part of the NACs, does it not? And so I don't see how ammonia gas dry deposition could be included in TDEP. That's my comment. And
How, well, could you include ammonia wet deposition, ammonium?
yes, because it's going to be a particle. It's going to be a PM before it deposits. Therefore, it's covered by the criteria pollutant.
Not necessarily.
You're saying ammonium is not a particle?
No, I'm saying ammonium in wet deposition has not necessarily passed through particle phase to get there.
Well, for it to become ammonium, it has to pass through the particle phase. You don't have gaseous phase ammonium. You have gaseous ammonia and particle phase ammonium.
So Jim, are you suggesting that we should not be recommending TDEP as an indicator?
Well, I mean, maybe it's for EPA to figure out in the next review whether that can be included or not. I mean, I guess we can leave it and let them figure out next time. But I do think it is something that would need to be considered when they do it. And maybe that's for the next review, and those comments can be saved for the next review. So with that said, I'll just leave it as it is. So.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And yes, this is very explicitly for the next review. So these technical arguments may hold weight, and this is something EPA will have to wrestle with. Okay, Bob, and then Stephen, and I see Alex has joined us from class too. So welcome back. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to weigh in a little bit on this ammonia discussion. Ammonia definitely is part of the TDEP measurement or estimate, but it's really a really small part of almost anywhere you look at it, and it's systematically underestimated on that. We're actually working with the EPA staff to try to address that, but I would argue of just leaving us alone for the argument because it's such a small part of TDEP. It's usually less than 1% of TDEP.
All right.
In terms of how they estimate it, the actuality might be higher once we do a better job of TDEP on that, but that's the case at the moment.
All right, thank you. And so we're headed towards leaving this text as proposed as is. Thank you. And Stephen, do you have specific edits to make to this?
No, not a specific edit so much as saying that ammonia gas can be taken up in cloud water and rainwater without going through a particulate aerosol phase. But one would nonetheless expect a fairly tight relationship between ammonia measurement and deposition of ammonium. Well, ammonia and ammonium aerosol measurement, some with respect to wet deposition of ammonium.
Thank you. And Alex, your hand dropped, so presumably you don't have more to say on this point at this. Okay, so it sounds like we have consensus on adding this text to the document as proposed. And then moving on this document, if Aaron, you want to move down to line 20. Minor change, just to make the transition, the sentence that starts because of the cumulative effects, we would just start that as a new paragraph and say in addition because, and then moving forward on line 24, where we're talking about a KSAC finding, the KSAC finds that the justification be edited to the KSAC finds that the EPA's justification for and so on. And then line 27, the sentence that starts with finally. And this is a discussion that we had yesterday that I think it was Judy Chow who recommended the wording. Finally, the EPA welcomes the potential for a mass or composition-based PM-based standard to reduce NNS deposition effects on ecosystems. So those are the all the proposed changes on page 27. And I'm thinking since let's see, we're going to be starting with the specific standard. So maybe before we move into that, we want to take a 5-minute break. So we'll come back in 5 minutes and then we'll move into the next part of that document and the specific standard recommendations.
Okay, and Leanne, I'm going to send you and Aaron some text.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, are people back or do they need a few more minutes? I'm worried about us running out of time, which is why I called for such a short break. All right, so we are now on page 28 of the draft document. And we have this is about the annual PM standard. And we talked about edits to the paragraph that starts on line 22 yesterday. And so the document that's in front of you has the revised text. And I think the main point is that it starts out with emphasizing the evidence that's in chapter 2 instead of bringing that up at the end. And then it rewords our discussion of the figures that are based on the EAQM approach to emphasize the points that were made in our general comments. And so those are the proposed changes that you see in front of you to that text. And then the paragraph that starts on line 30 is also edited, as you see on line 39 of this, 39 to 43 of this document. So the text at line 35 that there's a sentence to be deleted, and the other changes to the paragraph are actually on lines 39 to 43. So that's an error in this document as well. So any requested edits or changes to those proposed? So this is our advice for the PM 2.5 standard, the edits plus what's in the annual PM 2.5 standard. And so then moving on to page 29 and the annual NO2 standard deposition related effects. We talked yesterday about the sentence that starts on line 19 being dropped. And so that's documented here at the top of this memo. There were no other proposed changes to the annual NO2 standard. And for the annual for the for lines 24 to 37. So my question to the panel is, do we need to make any further edits to the annual SO2 standard deposition related effects? We've already, so on line 34 of that document, we've already earlier before we got into the specific standards, we already addressed how we're talking about the figures, the EAQM figures. And so we may not need to make further edits to this. If I'm going too fast, feel free to circle back if there's anything that I'm skipping over that we're moving too fast on. So I think we're now on to the 24-hour PM 2.5 standard. And we had, thanks to Rich Poirot, we had a completely revised text that would appear, that's currently lines 1 through 6. And it would be replaced with the text that you see in front of you on lines 6 through 29 of the document that's on the screen. And Rich, do you want to make any comments about this?
I guess the assignment, as I understood it, was could we develop a little bit better justification for the proposed changes to the short-term PM standards that we were advocating. So I tried to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Charlie.
Yeah, so I like this, but I have a sort of a gentle suggestion. In the first paragraph, Rich, you talk about occult deposition. Could we just get rid of this and say is dependent on fog and cloud depositions? Just say directly what we're referring to and simplify it and not create problems by using the word occult.
Fine with me.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. And between maybe Rich, you could send that in writing. That would be helpful. Bill.
Just a quick one. Does the group think that we should highlight ammonia emissions, since that's not directly regulated, but rather we should simply say there's strong variability in the PM 2.5 total and its individual components? In that first sentence of justification.
I'd be fine with that. I think I singled out ammonia because I think it's probably the most variable.
I agree totally. It is. but again,
We don't want to single it out. Yeah.
Nitrogen versus, so I think if we phrase it within the PM 2.5 considerations, then those are seasonal. I mean, the chemistry of those, I think, very seasonally. So.
Okay, so Rich, you can make some edits to reflect that comment too. Okay, thank you. Stephen, do you have edits to this text?
No, it's just that to comment that the use of the word occult for cloud and fog deposition has been derogated for about 4 decades.
All right, well, we've dropped that, so thank you. Praveen.
Yeah, I think, Rich, on line 9, do you mean deposition and not stagnation? When you talk about transformation chemistry, stagnation and transport, I think you mean deposition.
I guess I didn't mean deposition. I meant to say that there are meteorological variables that can affect short-term, can and do affect short-term concentrations in ways that may not be captured by annual averages. So winter stagnation, for example, would be one of them, or for that matter, stagnation during the summer over a source region, followed by transport downwind. Those are things that lead to high episodic concentrations. So I did mean to say it.
Okay, all right.
All right, so helpful conversation. Any further suggested edits to this section? All right, so we'll add this text as amended. I think that's the end of this document. So we didn't deliberate yesterday. Back to the main report on page 30. Total reactive N fraction starts on line 8, ends on line 15. We didn't deliberate on that yesterday, so I wanted to check and see if there should be any changes to that text. And this is just my lack of expertise in this area, but can somebody help me understand how this relates to our recommendation about the TDEP indicator? Is it related at all? Should we be alluding to that text at all here?
I'm sorry, I lost track of what text we were.
Okay, we're back in the main document, the consensus comments on page 30. I know there's a lot of, well, hopefully we're down to fewer, multiple documents. We got a few over the break that we'll need to talk about later, but we're back in our consensus comment. Total reactive N fraction of PM 2.5, total N PM 2.5 indicators. So it's page 30, line 8 through 15. And thank you, Aaron, for putting that up in front of us. I just wanted to know if we should, well, if there are any edits we need, particularly given our recommendation to add the TDEP as an indicator for total deposition, if there's any need to mention that here, and that may be just my lack of expertise in bringing that up, but so I'm going to call on Dr. Wirtz, and then Praveen will get to you in a little bit.
Thanks. I think here we're talking about an indicator within ambient concentrations. So this is the fraction of ambient PM 2.5 that is nitrogen, which would include, the nitrate and ammonium, and that's different than the reactive nitrogen component of TDEP, which is a blended model measured estimate of the actual deposition amount. So here, this again is in reference to an ambient indicator.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that for me. Praveen.
Yeah, I want to be clear, the word indicator here, because all the discussion we have in this section before, we always talking about a standard, SO2 standard, NO2 standard, 24-hour annual, and so on. So this is the first one with the underline, which is not a standard, right? This is not a standard in the context of the earlier standards we talked about. It's indicator for what?
Yeah, Rich.
So I think standards typically have 4 elements: indicator, averaging time, level, and form. So this is talking about the indicator component of a standard.
And for which standard then?
A standard which would address a standard which would be based on particulate matter N as quantified by the sum of N from oxidized and reduced nitrogen present in particle phase. That would be the indicator as a basis for a PMN based standard.
So it's a standard different than all the previous standards we just talked about? SO2 and NOx and PM 2.5?
Yes.
Or is it? Okay.
Yes, it's I think we've really have pushed this as what we think is a superior alternative to the use of a PM 2.5 mass indicator. That indicator is already kind of not all that strongly linked to N and S anymore. It used to be, but it's now that link is pretty weak, and it's getting weaker as time goes on. And so we were recommending this PMN as a superior indicator to mass.
So this will be the indicator, if I'm confused, I am, would be indicator for the 24-hour PM 2.5 standards, as well as annual PM 2.5 standard. This indicator for those 2 standards for PM 2.5.
I think the intent, as I remember, was that this was really referring to longer term averaging times. And we had other recommendations in terms of the short-term PM standard.
Yeah.
So
we
for,
did-
okay, so for the annual PM 2.5 standard we talked earlier, you're saying this indicator, the total N, is a better indicator than the way we described earlier, the annual PM 2.5 standard? Because
That would be my opinion. I think that's what the intent of this was.
Should this get moved then to after the annual PM 2.5 standard as sort of a subset of that? That we're also talking about the indicator?
I had actually thought that myself. I think that might help.
Yeah, okay. So we'll move it to after the PM 2.5 annual.
and not the 24-hour. And I'm thinking out loud, Rich, maybe it's good there too for 24-hour, the total nitrogen fraction, even on a 24-hour scale.
I'm wondering if Alex, since you were the lead author on this section, if you want to comment on this conversation.
Actually, my comment was on something different, so
Okay.
I'll wait a minute.
Okay.
Just to address Vin's question there, it may be that it would be a good 24-hour indicator, but I have no idea what kind of levels we'd be talking about or have anything to suggest proposing. I think what we proposed for the 24-hour indicators would be appropriate.
Okay, let's leave it as is. Just move this to after the move after PM 2.5 annual. And I also suggest it's maybe we add the word new, a new total and PM 2.5 indicator just for clarity. If that's okay.
And to be very clear too, Leanne, this is, I think, we are recommending for the next review.
Yes, it does that.
And even though all the other things we are recommending standards, they are for the present review.
Correct, correct. And it does say that on line 11 during the next review.
Can I jump in there, Leanne?
Yes, please.
I find the language awkward. A total and PM 2.5 indicators recommended to achieve a better measure, et cetera, including ammonium deposition during the next review. So I think we should just stop at ammonium deposition and say such an indicator could be considered during or should be considered during next review. I just find that awkward, the dangling during the next review.
Sure. And so we'll do some wordsmithing offline to make this more more clear. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, just real quick. In lieu of the word indicator, how about potential future standard?
Well, I think the point is that a standard, and this Rich said this, the standard's made up of 4 things, one of which is the indicator. So it would be sort of a part of the standard. It would be a piece of the standard. Praveen, are you still needing to talk about this topic?
No, sorry, thank you. No.
Okay, and Rich?
Well, so I guess I had not been thinking of this as necessarily a recommendation for the next time around. I think EPA has already done the work in this policy assessment document to consider what that is and to look at it. And so my intent was that they should take that up in the current review.
So
but maybe I got that wrong.
all right, well, we could, I mean, we're deliberating. We could just strike the during the next review text. I'd like some other opinions on that. If they've done the work, then and it could be considered now, then and it sounds like it makes a lot of sense. Maybe we should strike those words. I'd like to hear some more opinions. Praveen, is your hand up?
Yeah. I think I agree with Rich, because the point here, I thought when we wrote this language, or Alexander did, we try to bring ammonium in there. I mean, that's what the major goal was. So if we have a total N, which is both oxidized and reduced N, brings ammonium in. And that's the goal, then Rich is right. I mean, that could be done and does not have to wait for the next review.
Okay, thank you. Ivan,
I agree with Rich.
thank you. All right. Bob?
Me too.
Okay, so we're gonna drop the during the next review text. From Okay, so I'm going to ask, before we move on to the dissenting opinion, I'm going to ask Jim to go through that with us and talk about it, because we haven't had a opportunity as a panel to deliberate with him on the standards, and he's kept silent on our recommendations. So I want to make sure he has an opportunity to share his point of view. And again, if he maintains this dissenting opinion, or a version of this dissenting opinion, based on the new Case Act policy, this text will actually be moved to an appendix. But right now it's in the draft document because Jim was not present at our June meeting, and so did not have the opportunity to deliberate with us. And I think that deliberation is such an important part of the process that I want to make sure that we give him that opportunity, and people have an opportunity to have a dialogue with him about his point of view. So any changes, further changes to the text in Chapter 7 before the dissenting perspective? Okay, seeing no hands, I invite Jim to talk about his perspective.
Okay, thank you, Leanne. And I do apologize for not being at the in-person meeting. As I said, I did watch the YouTube video, so I did catch up on all the conversations there. And it's unfortunate I wasn't there to present my alternative recommendations at the meeting. But I'll do it now, and like to hear people's thoughts on it. So what you're seeing on the screen is what was emailed out. I did send to Aaron some updates to basically provide more background to why the recommendations I made were the recommendations I made. And since that's not up on the screen, I'm going to read that part real quick, but then we'll come back to the actual recommendations. And basically, I'm recommending to replace sentence 17 with 2 paragraphs, and I'll read very quickly, and then we'll jump back to here. One dissenting Case Act member has proposed an alternative set of recommendations that are not based on the EAQM model results. The EAQM approach has not been peer reviewed, and the results are highly questionable due to flaws in the conceptual model, simplifying assumptions, and missing processes leading to unreliable correlations between ambient air measurements and deposition values. Further, the results from EAQM generally show that the relationship between local ambient measurements and deposition values are poor to non-existent across all ecoregions, especially when looking at the most recent design values, 2014 to 16 and 2018 to 2020. As a result, it is not appropriate to use the EAQM modeling results to set the secondary standards for SO2, NO2, and PM 2.5. And my opinion is, if you take away the EAQM model results, the previous recommendations are pretty weak. That's just my thought. So an alternative approach involves looking at historical TDEP values over the past 20 years. The policy assessment documents a dramatic decrease in TDEP values. Okay, there it is. Oh, good, thank you. TDEP values after 2012. In fact, nearly all, and this is important, nearly all of the ecoregion 3-year average S and N deposition values are within the last 10 years. When we look at 2014 to 16 and 2018 to 2020, 3-year averages are less than 5 kilograms per hectare per year and 10 kilograms per hectare per year, respectively. I mean, basically, what this is telling us is these are kind of the targets that the last second recommendations was trying to get to, but the latest data in the last 10 years basically says we're already there. And this happens to correspond with the promulgation and implementation of the 2010 1-hour SO2 NACs, 2010 1-hour NO2 NACs, and the 2012 annual PM 2.5 standards. So this indicates that the current regulatory requirements are producing acceptable S&N deposition values. Specifically, the current primary NACs for SO2, NO2, and annual PM 2.5, which are significantly more restrictive than the current secondary NACs for those pollutants, have been and will continue to provide adequate protection against long-term annual S&N deposition-related effects. Therefore, the secondary NACs for SO2, NO2, and annual PM should be set equal to the current primary NACs for those pollutants. So that's the background. And then when we jump into the specific, thanks, Aaron, if you can jump back to the other, the original documents. Yeah, thank you. So this is where I go through and kind of basically lay out with a little more details, you know, where it shows that the current values are you know, for PM 2.5, you know, the sulfur nitrate depositions are below the values. Therefore, you know, the argument could be, it's really the thought here is it's not really one standard that has provided this great benefit. It's really a combination of, you know, the 1-hour SO2 standard, the 1-hour NO2 standard, and the current PM 2.5 standard. You know, when you combine those three standards together, the primary piece of those, that's really what has led to this significant decrease. And those primary standards are much more stringent than the current secondary standards. And so my recommendation just is basically to set the annual PM 2.5 at 12, annual average over 3 years, for the reasons listed here. For the 1-hour NO2 standard. So, you know, my argument is that the 1-hour NO2 standard and the 1-hour SO2 standard actually will provide long-term protection against deposition effects. And those are actually shared in my personal, my individual comments, where I created scatter plots of 1-hour design values versus annual design values for all of the monitors in the country for the last 20 years, to basically show the relationship between those. And what it does is, to me, it clearly shows that these 1-hour standards are actually providing really good protection against annual exposure or annual concentrations. So for NO2, again, the same argument. So I'm not going to repeat the argument here. But what it does say is that the draft policy assessment discusses the option to set an annual average NO2 standard as low as 40 ppb. If you look at the current short-term primary 1-hour NO2 standard, that already provides protection for annual average NO2 concentrations below 31 ppb, based on the plot in my individual comments. Therefore, setting the secondary standard equal to the primary standard is the recommendation. Continuing on to the SO2 standard. And again, it's the same argument. It's the same argument kind of 3 times in a row. But, you know, if you did set the current short-term, if the current short-term primary 1-hour SO2 standard already provides protection for the annual average SO2 concentration below 7.5 ppb. So the point is, the current 1-hour SO2 standard is actually much more stringent than what was actually proposed by the majority of the CASAC, which I believe was 10 to 15 ppbs on an annual average. If you're meeting the 1-hour SO2 standard, the highest recorded annual average for any pair is 7.5 ppb. So this 1-hour standard is really much more stringent. And then I go on to talk about the 24-hour standard, which was not, since no analysis was presented in the policy assessment related to the 24-hour PM standard of 35, I basically recommend keeping it unchanged. So that's kind of, that's an alternative approach to looking at this, where you basically set the primary standards or the secondary standards equal to the primary standards, because to me, it's been documented. I believe EPA had looked at this in the past, and at the time they didn't have the 10 years of implementation of these primary standards, but we do have that now. We have this evidence in front of us where we can actually see the amount of protection that the primary 1 hour standards have provided for the ecological effects. So that's where I'll leave it, and I'd like to hear what people's thoughts are on this proposal.
Thank you, Jim, for sharing that perspective. Davin.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And I guess I just have a question or comment, about some of the earlier parts of this, where you're sort of showing that, or discussing how ambient concentrations, for PM2.5 right now are such that, a lot of the deposition values are below the ranges that we're concerned about. And I agree with the data, especially for the more recent years, shows that most of them are. But I would argue that not all of them are, and that the outliers, there are some outstanding cases, are important, and that there are these hotspots, and it's either looking at a few data points from Chapter 6 or going back to the TDEP maps, and we see these hotspots where deposition values are exceeding the thresholds that we're targeting. Like I don't find it to be a totally solved problem the way that it's sort of covered in your summary. I mean, I think your words are correct in that you're saying we're mostly there. We're almost all the way there. We're 90-something% of the way there. But this is where we're not there. I'm concerned about the standards being set to protect those areas, or to protect areas from becoming in that range in the future. And just because we don't see an exceedance now doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of change in the future that could drive something like that. And that's something that I'd like to see sort of covered by the standards.
Yeah, good point. Yep, good point. I mean, I would have to count them up. I think all of them in the eco regions, all of them were below 5. I think there was one point that was above 10 for the nitrogen. So you're correct. But I will also say, not everybody is meeting the current 1 hour primary standards for SO2. And I mean, there's still areas in non-attainment for the current 1 hour SO2 standard, which means more reductions are to come. And for the 1 hour NO2 standard, although we don't have any monitors that are monitoring violations, those monitors are put mostly on roadsides. We don't have NO2 monitors near industrial sources. And I would argue that there are a number of actual violations of the NO2 standards that we just don't know about because we don't have monitors there. And that would be more of an implementation issue of maybe getting more monitors out or doing modeling around industrial sources. But and then PM, not everybody's meeting the current PM standards, either annual or 24-hour. So, the question is, when everybody in the country is meeting these standards, these 3 primary standards, what would the deposition look like at that point? And I would argue that at that point, it would actually look pretty darn good.
But we still currently have hotspots of deposition in areas where PM, is much lower than 12, and hotspots that are greater than 5 and 10.
Yeah, and I think most of
this
those
is based on looking at figures from Chapter 2.
Yeah, and I think
it's not the ecosystem analysis.
Yeah, so I think most of those would be due to the ammonium deposition. What I think you're talking about the sulfur ones or the total nitrogen ones. Yeah, I mean,
nitrogen.
The sulfur one, if you look, I mean, most of the countries below 5, there might be a couple of spots that, according to TDEP, are slightly above 5. But you're right. There's other ones that are higher for N total TDEP of N. Looking at the next picture, it does show that the majority of that is from ammonium. And actually, if you just looked at oxidized nitrogen, the values are and actually, Alex actually was kind enough to send me a graphic of that yesterday, which was very useful in that, you know, almost everything was below 3 kilograms per hectare per year for oxidized nitrogen. And really, most of this is being driven by reduced, which I mean, is a challenge since we really don't have the ability to regulate ammonia emissions directly is kind of a big challenge. So I agree that, you know, that is a challenge.
And I agree. I mean, while I'd like to see that be part of the regulations within the current framework, it just puts more of the burden on regulating that small fraction that comes from oxidized sources. Because the ecosystem impact, you know, is occurring, and so we'll use, you know, maybe a small wedge to get to less than 10. But if it's, you know, if it's 80% coming from ammonia, and I think you understand what I'm saying. We could reduce the oxidized components and help, because it's not zero. Anyways, I think I made my comment that, you know, there are these cases which I feel merit inclusion in our recommendations.
Yeah, and I guess it's also important to note, you know, just like health-based, you know, there is the Clean Air Act doesn't require a zero risk, and you know, it doesn't require you to get every place to a zero risk level, and that there always will be places that are you know, have higher impacts than others and things like that. And yeah, so it's not perfect, and I mean, I don't know if the standards proposed by the majority would get us there either. It's just hard to tell. It's you know, the advantage of this approach is, you know, it's based more on observations than a model that a lot of us don't have any confidence in.
So a couple of comments, Jim. One is that we made some edits to how we are talking about the EAQM model. And so I would suggest that you might want to edit your comments to reflect that. Because my understanding is we are not making standard recommendations based on the EAQM model. It's just supporting information. And so that's a very different point of view than saying that our recommendations are based on the model that many of us don't trust. So that's one comment. Another comment is that I would recommend, assuming you maintain this point of view, that your annual PM 2.5 standard not include the value, but maybe include just the current primary, because there is, as you well know, EPA is recommending lowering that annual PM 2.5 primary standard. And so I would think that you might want to make your recommendation to say it matches the current as opposed to putting an exact level. So those are two suggestions. Praveen.
Oh, and Leanne, just to address your first one. So I guess that when I said your first comment was actually more of an editorial, and that is not in my written comment. At least I don't think it is.
Okay, I thought it was some of what you had read, that it was the preamble to your dissenting point of view that you talked about that, but maybe I missed some details. Anyway, I just ask you to look at that, make sure update your, assuming that this is going to be kept, update it to reflect our latest version of our report.
Yeah, and I did say it. It's just not. I kind of ad-libbed, so it won't be in my written. So. Okay,
thank you, Praveen.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jim. I have a general question. You know, I think I got what you said reasonably well. The question I was thinking was, and I want to bring the people who know the ecology and ecological impacts a lot better than I do. I mean, are adverse ecological impacts taking place today? And not just hotspots like David mentioned, but in a number of places. And if that's the case, which means the current primary standards, the various primary standards, and they're being met, but the impacts, adverse impacts are still taking place, somehow making the point that you need secondary standards to protect ecosystems at a level more stringent than the current primary standards for those pollutants. So I want to hear from the ecological people, Charlie and others, current situation. Are the adverse impacts taking place even though standards are being met, therefore justifying the need for more stringent standards?
Hey, Praveen, can I make a clarification? So
Please.
I would argue the current primary standards are not being met. That's part of the issue is the current 1 hour standard is not being currently met at a number of places. The current 1 hour NO2 standard, although there's no non-attainment areas, it is not being met around many large industrial facilities. And the current PM annual and daily standard is not being met. So I guess my argument would be is once they are fully implemented and met, that it would provide adequate protection. So that's I guess that's my. I just want to make that part clear.
Then I think maybe I want to hear. I mean, I see Charlie on the screen. Even if they're met in the future, our primary standards, would we still be expecting adverse ecological impacts at those levels?
So I'm going to ask Charlie to speak up.
Yeah,
now.
yeah, I see him.
Yeah, so we heard yesterday that, in terms of lichens, that many of the values are well above values that they tolerate. There was a paper that just came out a few weeks ago led by Justin Coughlin, who did a very nice assessment of tree growth and survival across the Forest Service FIA data, showing where we are concerning the growth and survival of individual tree species relative to approximately current levels of deposition. And there's been a tremendous amount of recovery and improvement, but still there are many species that are having adverse impacts at current levels of deposition. So these values that are proposed here, I mean, they're good. They're much better than they were 20 years ago, but there's still adverse impacts that are clearly demonstrated in values below these values.
Okay, I'm looking at the time, and so it seems like we are going to maintain a dissenting point of view that will be put in the appendix, and Jim has had the opportunity to convey that, and several people have articulated why they don't concur with the dissenting opinion. And so I think we're at the place where we thought we might end up with moving this to an appendix, and then I think we can move on. Any further comments on this from anyone? We don't have a lot of time to try to change Jim's mind. So, Charlie.
I just, this is not really pertaining to Jim's dissenting opinion, but I wanted to hear from the people who led the comments on Chapter 7. I mean, I think we're throwing a lot at EPA, and I think we're making suggestions that go well beyond what was in the PA. And I just want to make sure that we don't want to hear, we don't want to see a revised PA back, because, I'm thinking that it may actually be a good idea. We're giving them a lot of suggestions, and I'm very disturbed by, we had that suite of plots and for the PA, and then we get new plots. I was disturbed by that, and I just wonder if we want to hear back from EPA. So I'd like to hear, from those folks who make these recommendations, because I think our recommendations are quite a bit different than what EPA was proposing in the PA. So I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page.
Okay, so I'm hearing you're saying two things. One is revisiting the decision about asking for a revised policy assessment, that we may need to do that, which
I want to hear what other people think. I just said what I think. I have concerns, and I think it might be useful for us to see that. But, the people who led the comments on chapter 6 and 7 thought long and hard about this, and I think they have some ideas for those revised standards, and I think that's sort of where the rubber hits the road, and I'd like to hear what their thoughts are.
Okay, yeah, and so we'll get their perspective. If Alex or others want to speak up to answer Charlie, that would be helpful. About what you were thinking and the fairly substantial changes from what EPA recommended. Go ahead, Alex. I'm not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
You know, I think initially in our group, we had included text saying that we wanted to see a revised version. But as others have stated, and maybe you too, Charlie, is I'm concerned about where that takes us in terms of getting our recommendations through. So is there even time for that? And where would that lead us, essentially? I don't know what that, if we saw,
we were told, even though this was very strange also, I was a little disturbed by this, we were told during our first meeting, even though they told us that there was this pending lawsuit, we were then told that it wasn't really any of our business and that was EPA's business, and our decision should be really irrespective of that pending lawsuit. So I just want to remind you that what EPA told us about that, Alex.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I have an answer for you, Charlie. I think I'm still trying to, like I said, process all of this in terms of, I think the question is, do we want to see a revised draft? That's what you're asking, right? Essentially.
Yeah, well, I'm disturbed. I mean, if it was only one piece, okay, fine. But I think, I think about the cumulative things, that these plots, I think this disconnect between the ISA and PA, I'm disturbed by that. I mean, how do you reconcile that? I think, and then there's a lot of recent literature that have come out, I mean, since 2017, showing increasing effects at lower and lower and lower levels over larger and larger areas. We heard that compelling testimony from Mike Bell about, the class 1 areas being impacted, exceeding critical loads. So it seems to be that there's a lot that was sort of, I don't know, not considered in the PA. And anyway, I just asking. We could hear from other people in your group if you,
Sure, and I guess I would also ask the question, Leanne, what would that look like in terms of, if we do go down that path and we ask for a revision, what does that process look like in practice?
Well, EPA could probably answer as well, and I invite them to speak up if they wish to. My understanding is that if we ask for a revised policy assessment, then in normal circumstances, at some point in the future, 6 months, whenever, we would get a revised one that takes into account our advice, and we would have the same review process we are undergoing, we did, and we are continuing to complete now. With the court order, that's not for us to consider, but it may be that no matter what we ask for, we won't get it. But I think our advice is based on science. And if we think that this is substantial enough that we need to see a revised policy assessment, we should state that very clearly. So Charlie is putting that on the table as even though we deliberated on that when we talked about chapter 6, we are revisiting that decision. We need to make up our mind pretty fast because we only got a little over an hour left to finish everything. So I guess maybe I'd be interested in a show of hands for people who would like to change our advice to seeing a revised policy assessment. Is there anybody who's in favor of that? You want to raise your hand? Stephen, you have your hand up already because you want to speak.
Yeah, you said revised assessment. I think a revised draft is what we would be seeing. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Currently, we've given it EPA discretion on it. And so I'm looking for how many people want to just ask for it.
I certainly want to see a revised assessment along the lines of what we suggested. I'm not sure I want to see the revised draft. And the other thing I was going to say is in the revision, I don't want to see revised figures. I want to see a lot fewer figures.
Okay, let's be careful. Well, I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but we're running out of time.
Okay.
So if we get a revised version to review, it will still be a draft because we don't review a final version. Actually, we have done that, and that creates other problems. We would be seeing a revised draft. So just to be clear. So I see 2 hands up in favor of that. Is that it?
Is that what you're doing? So you want us to raise our hands if we want to see it?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
so-
All right. So I'm seeing 5 people. Looks like we're reaching consensus about a revised draft. Only seeing a couple of people that aren't. All right. So we will change our advice in chapter 6 to ask for a revised draft, no matter what. That's where the place in the report where it appears. Okay, that's helpful that we got there, and thank you. I see a couple hands still up. I assume they're left over, except for maybe Alex. You wanted to speak?
So we asked for a revised draft, and that is for them to decide exactly what EPA decides exactly what they want to do and how they want to pursue that. Or our intent is for our comments to be included in that revision. So if we think about, are they revising the AQM approach or coming up with a whole new approach? That's for EPA to decide. Is that correct? Essentially, when we say revised draft, we can't control what form it takes or what analyses are included. We're opening it up essentially.
Yes.
Hoping that our advice is useful guidance. Is that
Yes,
fair?
well, traditionally, when CASAC makes a recommendation as opposed to a suggestion, EPA is supposed to listen to us. And so we have framed a number of our things as recommendations. And so we would expect that when we see when we see a revised draft, that we would see our recommendations implemented. So that is, and Praveen, you've had a lot of airtime, so I'm going to go to Charlie next.
I guess a question for you, Leanne, we've given them a lot of ideas, thoughts, suggestions. I know they're not required to, but do you anticipate they're going to respond to any of this? I guess I have concerns about sort of the whole basic idea about standards for welfare. And in my opinion, they've not really been done in a meaningful way. And I think what Jim is suggesting is maybe to throw them out. I don't know, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he wants to set them at the primary standard. So, are we wasting everybody's time by doing this? Are we serious about protecting welfare? I have concerns about this, and I'd like to see EPA, I'd like to hear what their intention is. Are we really serious about protecting ecosystems?
Yeah, so we could put some text in the draft report that addresses that. I don't think, given we've only got an hour left, that we have time to deliberate with EPA's point of view on this right now.
Well, it's just a question for you. Would they likely respond, or would they ignore us? Or what would an outcome of this be?
Well,
do you
given
think?
the court order, I'm not sure what to say. But without the court order, traditionally, when we make recommendations, EPA listens. So whether EPA will take secondary standards seriously and meaningfully, we haven't seen it with ozone yet. So whether it will happen here where the evidence is not as resoundingly clear cut as it is for ozone, I think is an open question that we need to wait and find out the answer. So I would encourage us to maybe put something in writing somewhere in this report addressing your point that we think that meaningful secondary standards are important. The other thing I wanted to bring up that I overlooked earlier when we were talking about the secondary standards is I think we should also make the recommendation that in future reviews that EPA keep all of the components of a secondary standard together. So we had this artificial separation, which has caused some heartache with visibility having been in the previous PM review and other aspects of PM in this review. And so I would like us to recommend that in the future reviews, all aspects of the PM secondary standards be in one review and not artificially separated. So any objection to that?
No.
Okay. Praveen, you've had your hand up for a while. We are running out of time. So if you have specific edits to the report, I'd like to hear them. Otherwise, I want to move on.
It's okay, we move on, but my key point was if you're going to make a recommendation to EPA to revise the PA, the draft, we should be very focused about what exactly those revisions would be, kind of bullet form. I hear from Charlie, out of date. I hear EQAM. I hear deposition versus concentration, those three things.
Well, I can't speak for the other sections, but in chapter 4 or 5, we tried to be very explicit about what we were asking EPA to do. That was clearly part of our mission. So I think at least in our session, we try to be as explicit as possible.
Yes, and that the whole point of this, our deliberations now is to finalize this written document. So if you're seeing something missing, please speak up. Otherwise, that's what we're reacting to. Alex.
I guess I want to be certain here about, how what I'm supporting. And I'm just curious if in some ways saying, well, what we really want is a revised draft, if in some way that sort of nullifies everything we've been talking about. So if we're saying we need a whole new revision, then do our proposed alternatives even mean it? Are they meaningful? If we're saying what we really need is a revised version. And so, and whatever we decide, I'm supportive, but I also believe we should know what the implications of our recommendations are.
So I think part of what we're recommending is not only a revised PA, but with the proposed alternative standards that we have recommended being considered. So we should say that. Does that answer your question?
It does. And I think that's a really important distinction for me, at least, because one thing is revise the whole thing and another thing is take these standards into consideration and revise with those in mind specifically. They're not
and based on that, and we'll work offline since our intent is clear, is we need to add that recommendation to chapter 7 as well, because chapter 6 was before we had our standard recommendations. So we'll need to add that recommendation to chapter 7 as well, so that we can address the alternative standards that we recommended. And so we'll work together on making sure that's in the written document. Okay, the very last piece of the consensus comments is on page 31, line 26, network funding. There were no suggested edits to that text. Just checking now. So Aaron's putting that up. And so I'm, if anybody has any changes, please speak up now. And then we need to go back quickly to the edits that Lori Chestnut proposed on the uncertainty section. Aaron has sent those out. People should have gotten them. So here are the edits, and Mark in particular, you were concerned about us overstating how we were relying on the trend. And so, and as Lori's talked about, the trend only suggests that more weight, scientific weight, be put on the more protective end of the range. So that's the paragraph that starts on line 22. So these are the proposed edits. Can you move down slightly, Aaron? Thank you. Okay, any further suggestions to this text? All right, while people are thinking about it, I ask that any other specific changes to the consensus comments be drafted now. Stephen, we saw that you sent out some comments, and I did not identify from your comments where that would go in the report. So you're welcome to put those as your individual comments. If you have any specific place in the consensus comment text that you want, oh, is this? Oh, I missed this. Thank you, Aaron, for sharing that. Okay. How did I miss this? Okay. So Stephen is suggesting on page 25, line 12, that the edits to the we already talked about this bullet on page 25. I think we agreed on that, right? What's on line 31. And then, so I think we already agreed on that bullet. And then page 27, line 16. Is this the text on line 38? Stephen, you want to help me navigate this? I'm sorry, I didn't see this particular document. I downloaded a different one. Stephen, are you available to talk about this? Okay, this is in the chapter 7's review of standards. Can you scroll down a little bit, Aaron, too, please? So Stephen, you're muted still. All right, I propose that since we're not hearing from Stephen about these edits, that we move on to the letter and come back to this if we need to. All right, so now we're moving to, and we have an hour left. So, and I want to reiterate to everyone that we are done deliberating. with perhaps that one point that we haven't talked about that Stephen introduced. We are done deliberating. So all we are doing in the letter is making sure that the letter is faithful to what we deliberated on. Now, in general, all of the changes we made to the consensus comments will get into the letter. So you can trust that. That said, we have the opportunity to make sure. And I see Stephen just came back. Shall we, how about we continue with the letter, and then we'll come back when we get to chapter 7, part of the letter, we'll come back to Stephen's comments about chapter 7.
That's fine.
All right, so we're on the letter, page L1. Are there any proposed changes to the letter, page L1? And Aaron, could you make your text a little bit smaller so we can see a little bit more of the I guess that's the main point. The text is what you're showing, so that's fine. Thank you. All right, moving on to the letter, page L2. Okay, not seeing any proposed edits to this. Anything on so this is all, go ahead.
Sorry,
Whoever.
couldn't find my hand. There in the chapter 1, but I guess you're saying this will be edited in the chapter 1 notes. There's discussion about the deposition standard, and it's not consistent with the revised language of the panels recommending that based on the science versus does the Clean Air Act allow it? So that's
Okay, so we need to make sure to edit that. That's the line 10 through 12. Make sure to edit that.
And I don't know if it comes up again in the letter, I don't remember maybe that's its own paragraph rather than.
Yeah, and everyone will have a chance to review the edits to the letter. So if we miss something when we go over this and make sure that all the changes to the consensus comments make it to the letter, people will have a chance to weigh in. That said, it is helpful for people to point out things that they know need to be changed. So thank you for that. So I'm going to move on to the summary of chapters 4 and 5. That's on the letter page L3. Okay, and that chapter 4 and 5 goes all the way to line 10 on page L4. And we didn't make very many changes to that section. L4 line 12.
Leanne, can I
Yes.
go back to page L3?
Yes, thank you. And I think I missed a hand. So
yeah,
yes,
that's fine. The sentence on lines 37 to 39 is identical to one of the sentences in the chapter 2 report later that we discussed yesterday. And I was given the task of working with Hans and Charlie to rewrite that, which I did earlier today. And we're in agreement on a substituted sentence there, which I've sent on to Aaron. And I could go into the detail, but I just want to alert people that we have agreed on changing that sentence here and also later in the chapter 2 report.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, we'll get that. And Ivan?
Yeah, just on line 5, the sentence, just drop the wording uncertainty and estimates of ecosystem weathering rates, since we dropped that section.
Okay, that's which page are we on now?
4.
Page 4.
L4,
Yeah,
line 5.
got it. Yeah, we'll
From
do
the
that.
word uncertainty to the word rates with the semicolon and.
Okay. Got it. Thank you. And Charlie?
On line 32,
This is page L3. Or
yes,
Uh-huh.
where it says it says NO2 and SO should be NO2, SO2, and PM, correct?
Uh-huh.
So we
Sure.
need to add PM in there because there's a recommendation for PM as well, right?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. All right, screaming ahead. Oh, Praveen.
Yeah, quick question. I think I didn't say it yesterday, but every time we say PM, we should say simply PM 2.5, because that's what we're talking about all along, not PM. Not
Okay.
PM 10, not TSP, not PM 1, but PM 2.5. That's what the standard is about.
All right. We're on page L4, talking about chapter 6. We made some changes to chapter 6 that can get integrated in here. Anything else people want to comment on? So page L5, there was a request by Mark Frampton for clarification on the sentence that appears on line 12. And it may be people can help me remember.
Yeah, it was just a language thing. At the last sentence on line 13 there, it says CASAC is unable to comment on the utility of this distinction. And I couldn't figure out which distinction.
Okay.
So it just needs a minor edit there.
All right, and we'll get the chapter 6 folks to fix that. Charlie.
So this is on line 39, where we talk about the EAMQ. The results should.
Which page are we
on? Hold on. Sorry, 4, L4.
Okay.
Okay, we use the word extreme caution. Can we back off that? I think we are using these values, right? But just with caution, maybe not extreme caution. And
Sure.
then we can say at the end of that sentence, the results are useful, and get rid of the word still.
Uh-huh. And I believe that this summary text appropriately reflects the multiple points of view we have about the quality of that analysis. And we will also update this to address our consensus about a revised policy assessment. Praveen.
Yeah, the line 43, 44, all the discussion we had earlier today. So didn't we say if EPA updates EQAM, or we keep the language as it is? CASAC recommends. that
No,
EPA update.
we're gonna update that language to not say if they update it. Well, if they update it, but we're gonna change that language to say want a revised policy assessment. Stephen,
Yes, the suggestion was made to replace extreme caution by caution. How about skepticism? And I'm serious. But also earlier, the KSAC committee was unable. No, the report was sufficient that no distinction could be drawn. It's not KSAC's fault.
okay, what line are you on? Can you help us?
I don't have access to the document, but the comment was made. It was the beginning of a paragraph that KSAC members were unable to do this, to do something thus and such. And
It's page L5, line 13, 1213. Without incorporation of the analysis, KSAC is unable to comment on the utility of this distinction. I think that's what you mean.
yeah, it's not our inability, it's their fault.
Okay,
It's wordsmithing, but it's important. Stick it to them, not us.
all right, we'll edit that to remove that text. Thank you.
I didn't hear a groundswell on behalf of skepticism.
Well, I wrote it down, so we'll probably replace that. I don't think anybody objected. They would have spoken up. So we're still on, I think we're still on L5. Is that where we are? So there's quite a bit of changes that are needed in the chapter 7 text. And I'm wondering if we should go back to the consensus comments and deliberate on the recommendation Stephen made, since you weren't, yes, we wanted to make sure we covered that. So, Aaron, are you able to put back up his comments, which I never seem to notice that I got? So here, that's probably where they are. So do you want to tell us about your recommended changes on page 27, line 16? And remember, we made substantial changes to that text already. So it's might be a little bit hard to follow exactly what you're recommending, since the text that appears in the letter that we have now, there were quite a few edits based on the document I shared this morning. And you are relating, so that paragraph starts out with a sentence that says chapter 7 adequately summarizes the information, which is going to be edited by Charlie and colleagues, may have already been done. And then goes on to say that KSAC urges the EPA to adopt secondary standards based on deposition. And then you wanted to elaborate that that's difficult to, well, relating atmospheric deposition to ambient concentrations is fraught with difficulties. Yeah. You want to go ahead and tell us what you're thinking and how it's going to be integrated with the other proposed text we have? You're muted. You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry, let me start all over. It's uneasy for me to be very specific of what I'm doing. I have a little control over what document I'm looking at. When I got the two screens at home, I can look at both at the same time, but I just can't do this here. I believe Aaron circulated a document this morning, a Word document that's called Schwartz comments on, etc. I don't know exactly where this sort of language would be inserted, but what I would like to see the language of the sort. Some of the members of the panel were uneasy about the use of EAQM or any other large-scale model, chemical transport model, as a means of ascertaining compliance with concentration standards or as a means of setting standards. I then got into the more specific part having to do with deposition fluxes. And again, I don't know exactly where this goes. I apologize. With respect to wet and dry deposition fluxes, again, some members of the panel were uneasy about the use of models to ascertain compliance for standard setting. It is not surprising, this picks up on some language already there, that there is little relation between SO2 and NO2 concentrations with wet depth of sulfate and nitrate, respectively. Before using this absence of relation or correlation to justify use of large-scale chemical transport model in lieu of such measurements, I don't think I completed the sentence or sentence fragment, apology. Better to estimate the relation between local concentrations of sulfate and nitrate with wet depth of sulfate and nitrate to ascertain whether concentration standards on those substances might be a better surrogate to wet depth of sulfate and nitrate than gaseous SO2 and NO2 respectively, and therefore be a path forward. If in fact, I also sent a document to Aaron late last night, which I've been trying to get some traction on. Nobody's been paying any attention to it. Maybe I haven't been doing it the right way to get it into. But one of the questions that I posed in that document, can EPA set deposition standards as opposed to concentration standards? My understanding is right now by the legislation, they can't. We can recommend that they get the legislation changed, that they can set deposition standards. But right now we're stuck with concentration. Therefore, if we're going to protect against deposition above some threshold, then we have to do it by a means of concentration. There's no other way to do it. That's the way the legislation goes. Therefore, how do we set a concentration standard? We set a concentration standard locally, not by use of a large-scale chemical transport model. And NO2 and SO2 are just not good surrogates for sulfate and nitrate. So measure sulfate and nitrate on whatever scale you can, and then set a depth threshold, a concentration standard that's based on a depth threshold. Okay, we can say what it is based on this or that model, but better if we get some correlations between local sulfate and nitrate and depth of sulfate and nitrate. And so that's what I would task EPA with doing, and not developing, put in lots and lots of man hours into developing worthless models like EAQM. So I'm speaking my heart. Now we have to be gentle, we have to be diplomatic, but that's what I'm trying to get across. So you have these two documents. There's one more specifically, page 25, line 12. I'm suggesting the change of the language. The use of nearby SO2 and NO2 monitors to evaluate SNN deposition at a given location may not be appropriate. That's diplomatic. Since the majority of the sulfate and nitrate being deposited is regional in nature and transported from far from that location and is not transformed locally from SO2 to NO2. Then again, specifically page 27, line 16, I give a suggestion for the replacement of the text. It's again kind of diplomatic. Relating atmospheric deposition to ambient concentrations is fraught with difficulties. That's the existing language. The Case Act did not reach consensus on the approach taken in the PA to establish quantitative relations, et cetera. But important, at upwind sources, source sites and deposition of NNS at downwind sites. But CASAC reached consensus that the description and methods need improvement. Further, the results derived from this quantitative analysis show generally that relationships between air quality metrics and deposition are not consistent across all ecoregions. Some members felt that effort to relate ambient concentrations or deposition at a given location to upwind concentrations is not an approach that will be of value in standard setting or compliance. So that's a quick read of the document that I circulated.
Okay, if anyone has, I'm proposing that we find the appropriate place in the document, which was probably not chapter 7, to put this text. It may be chapter 6, or it may be in the uncertainty section, which is where we talked first about fraught with difficulties. Anyway, but I wanted to hear if anybody has a point of view about inserting this text. This is not a consensus, because it, well, not all of it represents consensus. It represents at least some individual perspective. Jim.
I mean, almost everything you read sounds like it's already in the document. I mean, almost everything is already in there in some format. It's just not the exact words, but the concepts are all in there, written up already. The only thing I see possibly missing is, he's recommended nitrate measurements, which we've already recommended. There's a recommendation in there to use the species-stated nitrate measurements. I think he's adding in sulfate as well. So, but everything else he read seems to already be in the document, as far as I can tell.
Thank you. Does anybody have any objection to this text? I'm not seeing any objections.
Leanne, which
Alex.
of all the different texts, which one are we talking about?
I think we're talking about the text on the screen. We are specifically talking about if Aaron, if you want to move down to the text that on line 36, page 27, line 16. I'm suggesting that and maybe we could make it a little smaller so we see that entire paragraph in front of us. I'm suggesting that we will find a place in the document where we can insert this text, but it may not be on page 27, which is the chapter 7 recommendations. And Jim is saying that we've made these points, and other than possibly adding sulfate to it. Mark.
Yeah, and I agree with Jim. I mean, this sounds, this language is completely consistent with what we've been discussing previously. And I'm certainly in agreement with matching this to the sections that are most closely relevant to it, and adjusting the language if this seems to be an improvement on it. But I don't think I see anything new here.
Okay, thank you. All right. So I appreciate that. And I ask that we go back then and see if we can wrap up our discussion of the letter. This part is probably the hardest to do, which is the chapter 7 text. So we're on the letter page L5. We had considerable edits, which, given the late hour in our meeting, we're not really in a position to present, but we will make sure that the text for chapter 7 is appropriately updated with the edits that we have agreed upon. Quite a bit of new text got added, and it may be distilled in here, and people will get a chance to look at it. So the paragraph that's in front of us, lines 15 to 33, will get some substantial revisions. And then if we move to page L6, we have the all KSAC members recommended, and again, there might be some minor edits to this. I don't think we changed any of the values, but these are the summary of the recommended alternative. We are also going to add into, we're going to add in new text about seeing a revised policy assessment that reflects consideration of these alternatives. And then we have the text for one dissenting member. We will keep that because that it'll be changed to the appendix, reference to the appendix. Jim.
Hey, Lan. Yeah, last time I was allowed to give a sentence or two describing the dissenting KSAC, kind of a high level, what it is in a sentence or two, and I propose to include that in there. And I can read you what I had in mind. Actually, it was sent out by email already, so.
Okay, I'm running the meeting. It's hard for me to keep on top of the emails. You want to go ahead and read it?
Yeah, it was the one that was sent out Tuesday morning. One dissenting KSAC member felt that the current primary NACs for SO2, NO2, and annual PM2.5, which are significantly more restrictive than the current secondary NACs for SO2, NO2, and annual PM2.5, have been and will continue to provide adequate protection against long-term annual SO2, SNN deposition effects. Therefore, the secondary NACs for these pollutants should be set equal to the primary. And I can shorten it. I can take the parentheses part out, or put make it into one sentence if that helps.
Yeah, I think we want to be consistent with what we've done before. So keeping it short would be our goal. We can work on that offline. Does anybody have an objection to inserting some text that captures this point of view in about a sentence? Praveen, you're muted.
Yeah, page L6, line 18.
Yes.
The language respect to indicators. I thought we going to put that under the bullet under the annual PM2.5 standard.
Yes, we will do that. Thank you.
Not a bullet, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you for reminding us on that. We will move that.
And as far as Jim's appendix, I would change that to read some members, counting me.
Oh, what do you want? So, so you agree with Jim's alternative recommendations and not the standards that we, the majority?
I thought his presentation was pretty compelling.
All right, if you want to join his point of view, you're more than welcome to.
Just say some members and I'll let him take the credit for the appendix.
Well, if it's a very small number, what we have done when we put it in an appendix is be clear about that. So what you're saying is 2.
Okay, 2 members.
Well, just to be clear, this is referring to KSAC members. So it would be still one KSAC member, but this asterisk down here will just note that it also includes one additional KSAC member.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron, for making that clarification.
It may be in the future that you need a more stringent secondary standard, but right now, as far as the current standards are concerned, Jim made a very compelling case.
Okay, well, you're welcome to join his point of view. Any further comments on the letter? We will, as I said, we will incorporate all of the changes that that we have discussed. I know we've breezed through this really fast and haven't looked at those details, but the letter is just a distillation of our consensus comments. So I think we spent our time more fruitfully discussing the consensus comments. So I think, is there anything else that we need to agree upon before we move to accepting the report as drafted? And this is a vote of the Chartered CASAC members only, as drafted and revised. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody's hands up, so I'm going to ask for a vote. I'll be going through the members in alphabetical order. Except I'm going to start with myself since I'm chair, and I vote to approve the report as amended. And Michelle Bell, I don't think she's on. Aaron, did you get her vote?
Yeah, so she had to step out, but she had indicated that she was fine with the report.
Thank you. Jim Boylan.
Yes.
Thank you. Judy Chow, do you approve the report as it will be revised and finalized?
Yes, I approve.
Thank you. Mark Frampton.
Yes, I approve.
Christina Fuller.
Yes, I approve.
Thank you. Alexandra Panet Gonzalez.
Yes, I approve.
Okay. So we have completed our review of the report. We have gotten assent by the Charter CASAC members to approve it as we've agreed to revise it. We've got some work to do to get the final version all finished. And people have already sent in a number of edits, and Aaron in particular will be following up as needed to get any additional details that that we need to sort out, with the goal of getting this finalized in the next couple of weeks. Aaron, is there anything else I need to remind people of?
No, just to reiterate, we'll be in contact if you have assignments, and we will send out the revised report. And again, at that stage, it's just to make sure whatever edits we made reflect the discussions here. We're not looking for any additional edits that were not discussed. And then we will finalize that, transmit that to the administrator, and then we will be in touch if we hear about a second draft.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I think we're ready to close the meeting. Does anybody have any questions, further questions about anything? Not seeing anyone. I wanted to thank EPA, the Chartered CASAC, as well as all the panel members for all your work getting to this point. This represents an enormous amount of work, and I really appreciate all the individuals who have stepped up to finalize our work, and particularly want to acknowledge the members of the panel who worked to make some last-minute changes to accommodate that correction memo that EPA sent us and to revise our recommendations based on that. That was definitely above and beyond the call. And a timeline that was uncomfortable, but people did it, and I wanted to thank you for that. So enormous amount of work for everyone, a lot of work by EPA to get us to this point to have these conversations, and thank you all. Now I'd like to turn the meeting back over to Aaron in case he has any additional reminders and to adjourn.
Nope. Thank you, everyone. We can be adjourned.
Thank you, Luann.
Thank you, Leanne.
Thank you.
Thank
Great
you.
job,
Aaron.
Leanne.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Leanne.
Bye.
Thanks for your work.
Thanks
Bye,
for your
everybody.
work.
Thank you.